The sun did not rise in the way the people of the Nile had always known. Instead of gold seeping over the horizon, there came a strange dimness, a lightless dawn that cast no shadows on the temples or the fields. Farmers stood barefoot in the soil, rubbing their eyes in disbelief. Children clung to their mothers, uncertain if it was truly morning. Priests lit sacred fires in panic, thinking the eye of Ra had been plucked from the heavens. Egypt, for the first time in generations, was not warmed by the embrace of the day, but chilled by something unnatural, an invisible veil stretching across the sky. Even the birds hesitated to sing. The ibis circled the temple roofs with nervous cries, as if mourning. Dust hung in the air without movement, and the wind was eerily absent. The great statues of pharaohs seemed to scowl deeper than usual, their stone lips mute witnesses to the sky's betrayal. Traders paused on roads to Thebes, Alexandria, and Memphis, staring upward with uncertainty. The light did not brighten, and time seemed to stall. The world was caught between night and day, and in that suspended breath, fear began to take root. Across the land, on the banks of the Nile, a priest of Heliopolis wept as he tried to recite the morning hymn to the sun god. The words choked in his throat, their power broken without the golden chariot of Ra to receive them. Candles were lit within shrines that had not needed fire in centuries. Offerings of bread and incense were doubled, then tripled. The high priest called for silence, then for song, then again for silence. None of it made a difference. The light stayed grey, the shadows thin and wrong, and the gods, if they listened at all, did not answer. In the villages between Memphis and Abydos, whispers spread like desert fire. Some said the world was ending. Others claimed it had already ended, and they were walking unknowingly through the dew of the realm of the dead. Elders gathered children to recite protective charms. Dogs barked at nothing. Cats slinked into darkness and refused to emerge. Fishermen on the Nile reported dead fish floating in still waters. Their eyes turned to the ash-fog sky as if in accusation. The farmers began to notice something more sinister than the darkness. The crops were not responding. Wheat, which should have started its climb toward the sun, remained hunched and dull. Barley grew with no color. The Nile's flood had been generous that year, but the soil now felt wrong beneath their feet. Too cold, too silent. The insects that usually swarmed with promise were gone. The air was empty of bees. There were no frogs. Even the locusts, ominous though they might be, had vanished. Something deeper than climate was shifting. Word spread from city to city, passed through trembling lips and fading papyrus. The sky remained unchanged for weeks. No rain fell. No clouds moved. At midday, it was like twilight. Some of the foreign scribes who passed through Egypt wrote of it as the year without sun. In the halls of knowledge in Alexandria, scholars argued over celestial alignments, ancient scrolls, and natural omens, but no parchment held an answer. No calculation restored the sun. The smartest men in the land were, for once, without language, without prediction, without comfort. At night, the stars grew dim too, as if covered by a black cloth. The constellation of Osiris, so vital to the priests and their ceremonies, became a ghost in the sky. Those who followed the lunar calendars were lost. The moon, when it did appear, was sickly and red. Fishermen who relied on the stars to guide them stayed ashore, fearing the waters were cursed. Some believed the sun had been devoured by Api, the ancient serpent of chaos, and that no god had been strong enough to save it this time. The scribes recorded the change in tone across the temples. Where there had been chants of stability and protection, there were now prayers for mercy and survival. The scrolls held by trembling hands now spoke not of the greatness of Pharaoh, but of hunger, uncertainty, and the gnawing dread of divine abandonment. Even the language of the gods faltered. In Karnak, priests debated whether to rewrite the sacred texts to include this strange punishment, whether a new age of wrath had begun, or whether it was the final hour of the old one. The marketplaces thinned, coins lost their value. People began to barter strange things, old amulets, burial jewelry, even teeth and hair, anything thought to hold spiritual power. Mothers brought sick children to the temples, but the priests had no answers. They offered lotus oil, water from sacred pools, even blood sacrifices, but none of it lifted the grey veil above. The air remained choked with fine, invisible dust, the breath of some distant mountain that no one in Egypt had ever seen. In the years that would follow, they would say this was the moment Egypt began to forget itself. The unity of faith, the rhythm of harvests, the calendar of gods, it all began to unravel. The ashen dawn was not merely a meteorological anomaly. It was a wound to the soul of a civilization that had always trusted the sun to return. And now, the sun had lied. That betrayal would echo in every failing field, in every empty granary, in every weeping mother who could no longer feed her child. Pharaoh's court remained silent. Some say the ruler of the time retreated into chambers beneath the palace, refusing to appear before his people. Others believe he fell ill from fear, or from the same sicknesses that began to stalk the villagers. In truth, his name would be lost to the smog of history. This was not a time of triumph, it was a time of forgetting. When the records do not speak, silence reigns, and the ash wrote its own history on every roof, every statue, every mouth. Outside the necropolises, workers paused their chisels. Tombs, once commissioned with pride, were abandoned, half-finished, the dead piled faster than they could be buried. Funeral processions became hurried, less adorned, more quiet. Even Anubis, once carved in fierce protection, looked less confident beneath. The dim light, the jackal god, guardian of death, now seemed to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of souls drifting toward him. Along the river, the Nile seemed to hold its breath. Fish no longer leaped. Crocodiles disappeared from certain stretches, as if in hiding. The reeds no longer swayed in familiar rhythms. The boatmen sang their river songs more softly, in minor tones, their voices trembling in the hush. The Nile had been their god, their lifeblood, but now even it seemed confused, waiting for instruction from a sun that no longer spoke. Temples once crowded with worshippers stood hollow. The stone walls echoed with footsteps and uncertainty. The scent of incense, once comforting, now made some sick. The floors were smeared with ash and footprints, and in every corner, priests sat in corners murmuring prayers to gods who remained agonizingly quiet. The statues of Horus, Sekhmet, and Hathor were no longer approached with hope, but with pleading. Children no longer played beneath the date palms. Their laughter had vanished. Games were forgotten. Mothers kept them close, indoors, wrapped in cloth, trying to keep their skin warm and their spirits safe. At night, they cried without knowing why, sensing what their parents could not explain, that something fundamental had been broken in the world, that something holy had fled, and the emptiness left behind was colder than wind. The animals, too, felt it. Sacred bulls turned restless. Dogs refused food. Camels knelt and would not rise. The birds that remained flew in erratic patterns. Horses reared at shadows that weren't there. Even the insects, ever present in Egypt, dwindled. Beekeepers mourned the silence of hives. There was no honey that season. The sweetness of life was leaving with the light dot in scrolls kept deep within a forgotten monastery. A monk would later write of the same year. The sun gave no light for more than a year, and men feared the end of all things. Though the monk wrote from far beyond Egypt's borders, his words could have been carved on every wall, from Giza to Aswan, for all the world, it seemed, had been plunged into a shared forgetting. Some tried to flee, but where could they run? The shadow reached every corner, north or south, east or west, it made no difference. Caravan routes became more dangerous. Brigands rose. Cities turned on each other in fear. Rumors began to spiral, that the gods had fled to foreign lands, that salvation was only for the pure, that curses had finally found their mark. And yet, despite the fear, life clung on. In some corners of Egypt, people still woke each day, still baked bread from the last of their grain, still placed lotus petals in the mouths of the dead, still whispered names to newborns, despite knowing the odds, still kissed their lovers beneath the ashen sky, still sang, still believed. For though the sun had abandoned them, the heart of Egypt pulsed on in song, in sorrow, in shadow. For weeks, the sun remained a stranger. It rose each day in name only, cloaked in a veil so thick that even the birds hesitated before taking wing. The horizon glowed faintly, as if from behind frosted glass, but the warmth was gone. Egypt, land of unyielding sunlight, now moved beneath a ceiling of ash. The people learned to recognize the ghost of morning, a sluggish dimness that slithered through the reed fields without warmth or promise. Ra had not simply hidden, he had retreated. Each day he rose weaker, and the land felt it in its bones. In Memphis, scribes gathered on rooftops to watch the sky and take down what they saw. What they wrote was not poetry, but fear turned to ink. No blue, no gold, no sun disk burned above. The sky, they noted, remained the color of sorrow gray without texture, still without breath. The elders consulted scrolls older than dynasties, searching for prophecies or omens, but none described a sun that would forget how to shine. The sacred alignment of time, which balanced gods and men, was shattering. The heat, once taken for granted, now became a memory. The stones of the temples, once too hot to touch, grew cold even at noon. The palms did not rustle, and the wind was a hushed whisper, carrying only dust. The Nile's reflection, which had mirrored the heavens, was now a dull smear of silver, lifeless and unreadable. The priests debated among themselves in increasingly hushed voices. Was this a punishment, or a prelude to something worse? Was the world being tested, or was it already condemned? Without light, crops that once obeyed the seasons now refused to grow. The soil remained damp but unwilling. Shoots rose, then curled in on themselves, starved of strength. Farmers stood in their fields as helpless as the seeds. What was a farmer without sunlight? What was Egypt without grain? They knelt before their fields, not to tend, but to mourn. And in the silence between furrows, they asked questions they dared not speak aloud. What happens when the gods fall asleep? Children grew pale. Their limbs, once brown with sun and mischief, lost color and strength. Mothers massaged tiny arms with warm oils, trying to coax health into skin that had forgotten how to feel the sun. There were no sunburns that year. No stories of children sneaking into the river's edge to cool off. The games grew quieter, the laughter less frequent. A generation was being shaped not by sandstorms or floods, but by a darkness they could not name. Animals followed the pattern. Cattle refused to graze. They stood still for hours, staring into the dim sky with wide, wet eyes. Even the sacred cats of Bastet prowled nervously, their steps less sure. Poultry laid fewer eggs. Shepherds reported sheep stillborn. The life cycle, once as predictable as the sunrise, now staggered. Nature itself appeared lost. What was left when both man and beast lost their sense of time? In Alexandria, astronomers wrote to distant colleagues in Constantinople and Antioch, seeking answers. But the replies were the same: darkness, confusion, famine. In some regions of the empire, snow fell in summer. In others, fog consumed entire towns for days. The sun had become a myth, and even in Egypt, where Ra had always been king, his light could not be trusted. The center of the world had tilted, and there were no hands steady enough to set it right. In the deeper chambers of the temples, offerings continued. The rites were no longer acts of celebration, but of desperation. Chickens were slaughtered in pairs, incense burned non-stop, and old prayers were unearthed from dusty vaults. The hieroglyphs of the old gods were repainted, restored with trembling fingers, as if more color might wake them. But the gods, if they were present, kept their silence, and the silence weighed more heavily than the ash. Markets became war zones of need. Where once pomegranates and lentils overflowed in baskets, now there were empty stalls and bartering turned to shoving. Bread was hoarded, wine turned sour in damp cellars. Fights broke out over moldy figs. In some towns, it was said that gold could no longer buy grain but a knife. Perhaps, hunger was rewriting morality, reshaping Egypt into something unfamiliar and sharp-edged. Plague took its first tentative steps through the cities. No longer masked by heat and dryness, illness now found soft places to grow. Coughs echoed in crowded homes. Red welts marked the skin of children. Priests wore oils and amulets against disease, but these proved as powerless as their prayers. Sickness had always followed famine, but now it came swifter, darker. The balance had broken. The wall between the world of the living and the world of the dead had begun to thin. The pyramids stood, as they always had, immense, indifferent, but to the people, they now seemed more like tombs for the living. Tourists stopped visiting. The priests who once offered explanations to visitors no longer spoke. The wind that once danced along the desert's edge now carried nothing but grit. Even the echoes between the great stones had changed. They were deeper, slower, as if the past had grown heavier with every day the sun refused to return. At night, families lit oil lamps, sometimes two, sometimes more, to chase away the cold. Storytelling grew longer. The legends of ancient times when gods walked among men became less like myth and more like yearning. People recounted tales of Amun-Ra defeating darkness, not for entertainment, but for comfort, they whispered his name into the silence, begging for return. But the oil burned too quickly, and the light never stayed long. Old men sat at the gates of their homes, watching the dull sky with eyes that had seen the glory of sunlit Karnak, bright harvests, and bustling markets. They shook their heads, unable to offer wisdom. Their stories had no answers for this. What they had known was ending, and the new world creeping forward was one of grey skies, thin air, and silence. They stopped telling tales of their youth. What was the use? The children no longer listened. They were too hungry, too cold. Among the nomads of the desert fringe, strange beliefs took hold. Some said the gods had been murdered. Others claimed that the world had passed into another Cyclan age, not of creation, but destruction. Travelers carried talismans of clay, marked with protective symbols, wrapped in cloth, soaked in river water. They tied them around their necks and prayed not to be seen by whatever stalked the horizon. For now, the sky itself was enemy. In dreams, many reported visions of darkness that swallowed cities whole, of serpents winding through temples, of the sun turning its back on humanity and vanishing beneath the ocean. Dreams, once personal and scattered, now began to match across towns, across provinces. The collective unconscious was screaming. Something terrible had entered their world, and it spoke in images and nightmares no priest could interpret. The Nile, still flowing, was no longer predictable. Some years it surged too far, drowning fields that never dried. Other years it pulled back and refused to rise. The sacred calendars failed to align. The stars, their guides, were muted. The scribes wept over charts that no longer made sense. The order of the universe, Matt, was crumbling, and with it, the assurance that Egypt would continue as it always had. Among the soldiers garrisoned at the borders, discipline began to unravel. There were rumors that some had deserted, fearing that war was useless in a world already dying. Foreign incursions increased as neighboring tribes sensed Egypt's weakness. Skirmishes broke out, villages were sacked. No reinforcements came. Even the sound of sword against shield seemed fainter under the silent sun. The gods carved into temple walls seemed to recoil. Their wide eyes and rigid postures, once symbols of order and eternity, now looked like frozen fear. The light that once struck their faces with divine beauty now left them shrouded in gloom. Pilgrims came less and less. Even the most devout began to question whether the gods had ever truly lived, and those who still believed found their belief aching and alone. In Upper Egypt, a prophet emerged, draped in white linen, claiming that the end had begun. He preached in the streets of Edfu, saying that all of this had been foretold, and that only those who buried their names would be spared. People listened. They burned old tokens. They gave up names to the wind. They painted their doorways with ash and silence. But the darkness did not leave. The prophet was later found drowned in the Nile, his mouth stuffed with grey reeds. The craftsmen, the bakers, the scribes, all began to falter. Pots were left unpainted, scrolls unfinished, bread burnt or spoiled. It was not laziness, it was despair. Productivity, the heartbeat of a thriving nation, fell silent. People moved more slowly, spoke less. Their eyes grew dull, as if the lack of light had begun to feed on their spirits as well as their bodies. And yet, beneath it all, somewhere deep, hope clung like a weed between stones. A mother still hummed a lullaby to a hungry child. A priest still lit his candle and recited a hymn. A girl still carved her name into a wall, defiant against the fading world. Egypt had seen floods, famines, invaders, plagues. Perhaps the sun would return. Perhaps Ra would remember them. Perhaps light was not dead, only sleeping. It began subtly first, in the breath, where the exhalation no longer vanished quickly in the early light, but lingered like mist. Then in the fingertips, which once burned from touching sun-warmed clay, now remained stiff even in midday's dim imitation of heat. A chill had descended upon Egypt, not the ordinary coolness of nightfall, but a strange and biting cold that had no place in the land of Ra. It was a cold that did not belong, a breath from some forgotten world, crawling under doors, seeping through limestone, and settling into the hearts of all who lived beneath the ashen sky. The people were confused. Egypt was not meant for cold. They had no words for frost on papyrus, no rituals to greet a sunless winter. The great desert, once dry and fierce with heat, now carried an edge that stung bare feet and punished open skin. Workers wrapped themselves in woven blankets normally used for burial preparation. Children stopped playing along the Nile's edge. Even the crocodiles, ancient and unyielding, retreated into the mud and did not stir. The land that had sung with warmth now hummed with stillness, and that stillness held teeth. Clay jars cracked in the mornings from the sudden drop in temperature. Date palms shuddered and dropped their fruit too early. The mud brick walls of humble homes, designed to resist heat, now trapped the unwelcome chill. At night, entire families huddled together in corners, feeding fires made from old furniture and broken tools. Warmth had become the new form of wealth, and even priests robed in centuries of divine confidence shivered as they recited mantras into the unhearing dusk. Along the shores of the Nile, water carriers moved slowly, their amphorae clutched tightly, not for fear of spillage, but for the illusion of warmth against their skin. The river's surface steamed faintly in the mornings, a sight no one living had seen before. The Nile was used to giving life through its flood, not warmth through its skin. Fishermen abandoned their routines, afraid that the cold was a sick omen from Sobek, warning them to leave the river alone until the balance returned, if it ever would. In the sacred gardens of temple complexes, lotuses drooped and failed to bloom. The fig trees bore no fruit. The air itself had turned foreign. The bees that had once danced around flowering bushes were gone, their hives abandoned, their hums absent. Nature's rhythm had not just skipped a beat, it had lost the entire song. The temple keepers watched with helpless hands as offerings withered before they could be laid at the feet of the gods. Even statues of Bastet were wrapped in cloth, as if the stone itself needed shielding. Men with weathered faces and sand-worn feet spoke of faraway lands where snow fell from the sky. It was said to be beautiful, gentle, like feathers. But in Egypt, snow was not a curiosity. Here, cold was a terror, a sign that the very bones of the earth were cracking. People began to wonder if the balance between Mat and chaos had truly broken. If the cold was not just nature, but punishment. Something had been stirred in the divine, and Egypt was now its playground. In the high places, where the wind had once carried warmth from the deserts to the cities, there now blew only silence. Even the hawks, those symbols of Horus, flew lower, slower, uncertain of their purpose in this new world. Their shadows, once bold and sharp in the blazing sun, now fluttered without confidence, scattered and unclear. The horizon had lost its color. The sun's path, once a precise arc followed by every sundial and calendar, was now blurred and trembling. Scribes recorded temperatures with confusion. Their hands shook, not from fear, but from numbness. Ink dried more slowly. Papyrus curled unnaturally. Even the sacred scrolls, kept in warm chambers for centuries, developed strange cracks. The knowledge of the past, encoded in thousands of glyphs, was physically rejecting the present, and the scribes, so trained in control and elegance, began to write faster, fearing each day's cold might erase them before they finished recording what had been lost. People wore multiple layers of linen, though linen was never meant for insulation. There was no wool to spare. Egypt imported such things, and the trade routes had long since collapsed. Merchants sold scraps of leather and goat hide at absurd prices. Thieves began stealing not gold, but firewood. The flicker of a flame in the night became a beacon for danger, drawing desperate eyes and colder hands. Fear no longer came only from hunger, but from the wind and the absence of warmth. There were reports of snow in places that had never seen it before. Light flurries dusted the highlands of Sinai. People ran outside to catch the white crystals in their palms, and for a moment the children laughed. But when the snow did not melt, when it stayed on rooftops and turned into ice that shattered tiles and cracked clay, the laughter turned to dread. Egypt was changing into something unrecognizable, and there was no one to explain why. Some began to blame foreign gods. Temples to Amun and Ra received fewer offerings, while small shrines to unfamiliar deities appeared overnight, built from stones and old planks. Symbols of moons, serpents, and dark birds were carved into alley walls. The old faith wavered beneath frost-laced rooftops. If Ra could no longer bring warmth, perhaps someone or something else would. But every new shrine burned out just as quickly, its candles smothered by the cold breath of dawn. The sick suffered most. Fevers burned, yet hands and feet turned blue. The healers were overwhelmed. Their jars of honey, myrrh, and sacred oils dwindled. Some resorted to desperate concoctions, grinding snake bones, boiling bark. Nothing worked. The sick rooms overflowed, and the cries that echoed from them were sharp, brittle sounds that the wind carried into every home. Death had once come with heat and sweat. Now it came with a shiver dot in the royal courts. The nobility wore layers of embroidered cloth and spoke in hushed tones. The servants lit fires, but even the marble floors of the palaces turned cold beneath the feet. Pharaoh's inner circle whispered of curses, of celestial battles unseen. Some called for the old magicians, long dismissed, to return and break the spell. But even the most ancient sorcerers, with their blackened scrolls and owl-feather charms, could not chase away a sky that had turned its face away. The land, always so tied to warmth, now rejected touch. Sand that once felt like silk, now stung like glass. People stepped carefully, avoiding puddles that froze over. Clay pots froze and shattered. Wells turned to glassy mirrors. Cooking became a risk. Water boiled too slowly. Fires required more fuel than families could find. People learned to eat cold, to chew without heat, to swallow without comfort. Warm meals became a memory as distant as childhood lullabies. In the mountain villages, entire communities vanished. Shepherds stopped coming down with their flocks. Smoke no longer curled from chimney holes. When messengers were sent to investigate, they returned with hollow eyes, saying the houses were intact, the fires cold, the meals half-eaten. No tracks, just stillness. It was as if the cold had taken not just breath, but presence, erasing without sound or violence. The artists lost their color. Paint, mixed in palettes, refused to dry properly. Statues carved in limestone crumbled from the inside. Even music, once a comfort, became slower. Drums cracked, flutes froze. Performers sang more quietly, as if afraid to wake something. The cold touched not only the body, but the soul. Joy itself retreated, folding itself into memory, waiting for a sun that no longer answered its name. The river priests dreamt of Sekhmet, goddess of fire and vengeance, trapped in ice. They described her golden eyes, wide with fury, her breath fogging as she clawed at the frozen bars of her prison. In their dreams, she screamed, but no one could hear her. They awoke shaking, their skin covered in a fine sheen of ice. It was not a metaphor. They believed she was truly imprisoned, and Egypt would remain frozen until her chains were broken. Funerals were conducted more quickly. The dead turned stiff too fast. Wrapping them took twice the effort, and the oils did not soak properly. The rituals had to be adjusted, words shortened, steps skipped. The sacred timing was off. Even Anubis was said to look displeased in his stone-carved form. The gods of death were growing impatient. Their realm was too full, their rituals too neglected. In one village, the people buried a statue of the sun, in the hopes it would be reborn. They dug deep into the cold soil, sang old chants, and sealed it with a golden disc. But days later, the pit caved in, swallowing the statue whole. They took this as a sign. Some wept. Others wandered into the desert and did not return. Hope, even false hope, was becoming too costly to hold. The children born during this time were called the Grey Ones. Their eyes were pale. Their skin never darkened. They cried less, spoke later, and seemed to stare too long at the sky. Elders said they were not cursed but changed, that they were born beneath a sky not meant for life, and that their souls had been forged in frost. No one knew what they would grow into, only that they were different, and different, in a world unraveling, was terrifying. Still, the cold deepened. It coiled around temples and palaces, wrapped itself around history, and sat upon Egypt like a great and silent predator. Fires flickered weakly. The prayers became less frequent, and somewhere, far above the clouds, the sun turned slowly behind the veil of volcanic ashy silence, distant and utterly indifferent to the suffering of the world it had abandoned. The granaries of Egypt had once been its immense stone structures filled to their arched ceilings with barley, emmer, lentils, and dried figs. Their shadow cooled the markets of cities like Thebes and Memphis. They symbolized not just wealth, but order, a harmony between the Nile's generosity and man's obedience to divine cycles. But in the cursed year, their doors creaked on rusted hinges, not from fullness, but from rot and emptiness. The air inside had lost its sweetness. The scent of grain was replaced by mildew, mouse droppings, and despair. What grain remained had spoiled. The moisture from the cold, unnatural weather had seeped into sacks once sealed tightly by temple workers. Molds bloomed in quiet corners, grey and white like the ash hanging in the skies. Rats chewed through the wooden bins with a kind of fury, their hunger matching that of the men outside. Guards who once stood proudly in leopard-skin sashes now sat on overturned baskets, gaunt and shivering, knowing there was nothing left to protect but memory and dust. Across the land, farmers wept at the sight of the empty storehouses. Many had prayed that the famine would be brief, a single missed harvest. But with the second season's failure, and then the third, they knew. The cycle had not simply stumbled, it had shattered. The soil had betrayed them. The sun had abandoned them. The gods, it seemed, had forgotten them entirely. Some villagers dug into the granary floors with their bare hands, convinced there must be a hidden supply beneath the surface. Priests ordered the opening of the royal reserves, those granaries tucked deep inside palaces and temples, long untouched, meant for war or divine punishment. But even there, the supplies had dwindled. Termites had eaten through the sealed doors. Scribes lied in their tallies, too frightened to report the truth. And when the doors opened, there was no miracle, only barrels of dust. Panic spread faster than fire. There would be no salvation from the crown. Pharaoh's own servants had begun to thin. Bread, once the meal of every class, became rare. Those who could afford flour mixed it with sawdust or ground bone. Cakes turned bitter. Meals shrank. Merchants began to sell flour in clay thimbles, then in pinches. What had once been taken for granted, a loaf beside the fire, a crust in the hands of a child, became treasure. People fought over crumbs. A stale bun was traded for a necklace, then for a life. Gold was useless. Bread was God. In the alleys near temples, people gathered around communal ovens that no longer burned. The old women who once sang while kneading dough now sat silent, hands idle. Children pressed their cheeks to the oven's stone mouths, desperate to feel even residual warmth, but there was none. The ovens had nothing to cook. Even the sour scent of rising dough had vanished, replaced by the smell of ash and empty bellies. The grain measurers, once respected civil officials, now walked with their heads bowed. They had failed. The black wooden rods used to measure harvest yields now leaned against walls, unused. In some cities, they were burned for heat. Their markings, once a language of abundance, faded in the flames. The symbols for full overflow and plenty were now meaningless. Only gone mattered now. People began to eat strange things. Clay mixed with seeds, leather softened in broth, papyrus boiled to a bitter mush. Cats disappeared from the streets, so did dogs, so did birds. The sacred animals, once protected by law and worship, became silent sacrifices to a greater god's survival. Some whispered of darker meals, of flesh stolen from fresh tombs. The line between hunger and horror blurred. At temple complexes the offerings changed. Instead of grain and beer, the altars received stones, dry feathers, prayers scrawled on bark. The gods, they hoped, would understand the desperation, but the statues remained still. The incense turned acrid, and the people grew thinner. Their shadows no longer touched the walls like they used to. Even their voices sounded lighter, as if hunger had eaten the sound from their throats. In distant villages, families fled. They left behind their fields, their gods, their ancestors. They wandered toward cities in hopes of charity. But the cities were no better. Memphis had riots. Thebes closed its gates. In the Delta, it was said, there were towns where no one remained. Empty homes filled with gnawed furniture, cracked pots, and sandals lying where their owners had fallen. Egypt's lifeblood was draining. Out through the cracks of its granaries, some tried to grow new crops, planting what seeds they had left in hidden corners, in courtyards, on rooftops. But without the sun, without bees, without rhythm, the seeds did not answer. The people prayed over them, watered them with tears, sang lullabies into the soil. Nothing grew, not even weeds. The land had become a mouth sealed shut, unwilling to speak, unwilling to feed. The scribes documented the famine in hurried script. They carved warnings into walls, not for their fellow man, but for those in the distant future. They wanted the message preserved. This was not merely hunger, it was erasure. The gods were not angry, they were absent. The land was not cursed, it was abandoned. Their lines trembled with emotion. "We have eaten our memories," one wrote, "and now we have nothing left." In the royal palace, Pharaoh issued decrees, grain rations, price controls, punishments for hoarding, but they were ignored. The guards themselves were starving. Messengers defected. The scribes recording the orders fainted at their desks. The paper remained unsealed. No one had the strength to carry words across the land anymore. And even if they did, the people no longer believed in the power of ink. Artisans began etching hunger into their work. Walls once meant to depict lotus flowers, and victorious pharaohs now showed thin figures, rib cages like cages, hands reaching skyward. A new visual language emerged, one of longing, of famine, of a people starving not only for food, but for certainty, for light, for a sign that the cycle would return, that Ra had not closed his eye forever. In tombs, even the rich began to downsize. There were no longer enough workers, nor offerings to bury. Coffins were reused, burial rites shortened. Some corpses were wrapped in old tapestries, others buried beneath their own homes. The afterlife, once guaranteed through ritual and grain offerings, now seemed distant. If there was no bread for the living, what was left for the dead? At Karnak, one of the last functioning temples, the high priest led a ceremony in which the remaining stores of grain were given not to the gods, but to the people. A reversal of tradition. He said that if the gods lived, they would understand, that the divine must dwell in mercy now, not in glory. The gesture was praised, but the grain lasted only 2 days, and the priest disappeared soon after, his chambers ransacked, his sandals left beside the altar. In some corners, children no longer cried. They had grown used to hunger. Their bellies were flat, their limbs thin. They looked up at their mothers with eyes too wise for their years. In their silence was a terrifying truth. This was their normal. This was all they knew. The famine had become their language, their lullaby, their god. Dreams changed to no longer visions of green fields or the laughter of gods. Now dreams were of bones, of empty tables, of mouths moving with no words. People awoke with clenched jaws, gnawed fingernails, tears that never quite fell. Sleep, once a refuge, had become another form of starvation, one where the soul hungered for a world that no longer existed. When the sun briefly pierced the veil, people rushed outside in disbelief. The light was weak, pale, but it cast shadows again. Children tried to play. Men threw their arms upward. Women wept. But by midday, the light had faded. The ash returned. The cold returned. And hope, which had begun to stir, was once again locked in the granaries of the God-sealed, unreachable dot. In desperation, people turned to older beliefs, older even than the gods of Ra and Isis. They summoned the names scratched into pottery. Fragments whispered the chants found in forgotten tombs, begged spirits to intervene. But the spirits, like the gods, gave no reply. The granaries remained silent, their doors wide open, their bellies empty, symbols of a past that could no longer feed the present. Eventually, silence fell over the granaries. No more guards, no more hope. They stood like tombstone mouths, that once sang with grain and now mourned in stillness. The mice left, even the rats grew thin. The doors, once bustling with voices and carts, now echoed only with wind. A new kind of silence, one that said, "There is nothing left." The sky had once been Egypt's eternal ceiling, colored in rich blues and peppered with golden stars, a canvas stretched by the gods themselves. It was where Nut arched her sacred back, birthing the sun each day and swallowing it each night. But now, it bore no resemblance to divinity. Instead, it hung heavy like wet linen, wrapped tight with a veil of ash that refused to lift. It was not night nor day, but something in between, a world smudged by charcoal hands that blurred the very edge of time itself. At dawn there was no chorus of color. The usual soft rise of oranges and pinks had been stolen. Instead, a grey band widened over the Nile, dull and cold, like a bruise spread across the heavens. Birds no longer soared in silhouette. Even the ibis, sacred and enduring, had abandoned its flight. The people squinted toward the horizon, trying to will the light into existence. But all they found was a stubborn twilight that clung like sorrow to the bone. The black veil was not merely a metaphor, but a curtain of choking dust that turned breath into effort and vision into haze. Ash rained gently in a steady drizzle, as if the gods above had ground their temples into powder and now scattered their remains across the world. Roofs were layered with soot, and walls once carved with luminous paint now faded beneath the relentless fall. Eyes burned, lungs wheezed, even the Nile wore a duller sheen. reflecting not the heavens but a silent funeral pyre. Farmers who once woke with the sun now rose without reason. Their crops were dead, their animals gone. The roosters cried less. The bells of morning prayer lost their meaning in a world where day never fully arrived. It was not just the land that mourned, but time itself, unable to push forward under the crushing sky. Calendars were meaningless, the stars hidden. Even the moon offered no guidance, just a pale smudge among darker clouds. Children grew up without ever seeing a sunrise. Their drawings in the dust depicted suns with angry faces, not warmth, but curses. They asked their mothers what blue was, for it no longer lived in the world they knew. Some pointed at faded tiles or the deep pools of temple mosaics, trying to resurrect a forgotten hue. But the ash always returned, settling even on memory, even on hope. Scribes recorded the veil's endurance: day 50, day 90, day 120. They documented with disbelief how it had not broken. Some called it a punishment, others a test. Priests flipped through the oldest scrolls, seeking meaning in ancient omens. They found tales of celestial battles, of serpents swallowing the sun, of Apophis rising unchecked. But even those warnings felt too gentle. This was not a single demon. This was an undoing dot in the heart of the cities. People built towers of wood and lit fires in desperation. They believed if they could pierce the veil with flame, the gods might see their suffering. But the flames were meek, devoured by wind and ash. Smoke rose only to be lost in the greater darkness above. Offerings were left in open fields: bread, oil, prayers written in red ink, but they remained untouched. Even the scavengers had vanished. Travelers spoke of seeing the same veil in distant lands, that it stretched beyond Egypt, over the seas, across the mountains, and into the lands of the Hittites and Greeks. A shroud upon the earth, not just a region, a global mourning cloth that no priest or pharaoh could lift. Word came of famines elsewhere, of cities in silence, of rivers that forgot to flow, and Egypt, proud and ancient, was no longer alone in its despair. The astronomers were perhaps the most broken of all. Their instruments, once precise and sacred, became relics of a forgotten world. They could no longer chart the movement of the sun, could no longer predict festivals or solstices. The stars, hidden for months, might as well have ceased to exist. Temples that revolved around celestial precision were now hollow halls echoing with uncertainty. The black veil changed how people dreamed. Before, dreams were filled with fields and gods, boats on the Nile, golden chambers beyond death. Now, the veil crept even into sleep. People dreamed in grey, of endless ash, of falling from skies with no ground. Nightmares mirrored waking life. Dreams became warnings, not escapes, and upon waking, they found that reality was far worse than the things behind their closed eyes. Myths evolved. In whispers, people told stories of the sky being stolen, that the sun had been kidnapped by jealous spirits, or hidden by Set in a cave deep beneath the desert. Children were told not to cry too loudly, lest the ash spirits hear and bind their souls in smoke. Fear clung to every syllable, every lullaby, every tale. Stories were no longer about kings or gods, but about survival, about the monsters that fed on silence. Some looked to the Nile, Egypt's eternal ally, but even the river seemed muted, its flow slower, its fish fewer. The veil dimmed even the water's voice. Sailboats drifted with limp sails. Crocodiles, once symbols of divine judgment, no longer surfaced. The reeds that lined the banks wilted. The river sang no more. It whispered, as if afraid of waking the sky. In desperation, people painted the sun onto walls and rooftops. They used the last of their ochres and yellows to summon it, drawing circles with rays that reached out like arms. They danced beneath these symbols, clapping, crying, begging. But the ash covered the images in hours. The sun could not be painted back into being. Its warmth could not be conjured by faith alone. Time felt like a wound that never closed. Without the sun to mark the day, hours stretched long and featureless. Work ceased. Rituals were abandoned. Days and nights blurred together in a slow dirge of cold and darkness. Even the seasons lost their shape. The year of the veil, as some began to call it, unfolded without form or mercy. A pause in history, a tear in the wheel of Mat. The priests, ever defiant, held sunrise ceremonies in empty courtyards. They burned incense, read from scrolls, faced the horizon where the sun should be. They kept doing it long after belief had faded. Not out of faith, but habit. They feared what would happen if the rituals stopped completely, if silence truly became absolute. The gods had vanished, but the rites remained like bones of a long-dead beast. The veil began to change people's skin. Exposure to ash and sunless air made them pallid, sickly. Eyes grew sunken, lips cracked. Some began to believe the sky had cursed their very flesh. Healers turned to ancient recipes and potions, but the ingredients were gone. They crushed stones, burned bark, chanted over jars of nothing. Disease spread not just through famine, but through the air, the mind, the belief that light might never return. Families huddled together in their homes, blocking doors and sealing windows, not to keep out invaders, but to keep out despair. Rooms that once echoed with laughter now hosted only the sound of shivering breath. People spoke less, voices carried more pain than comfort. The air, tainted by ash, made speaking an effort. Even the gods were invoked in whispers, as if too loud a voice might anger the sky. Scholars tried to name the veil. Some called it the smoke of judgment, others, the breath of the desert. A few dared to name it Ra's mourning, but all the names fell short. Nothing captured its totality, its persistence. It was not a cloud, not a storm. It was a new element, a fifth essence born of grief and decay. An erasure draped across the world. Even the temples began to crumble. Their stones, blackened by soot, cracked in the cold. Statues of Horus and Thoth wore cloaks of dust. Tourmaline and turquoise inlays lost their luster. Pilgrims stopped arriving. The great halls echoed only with the soft patter of falling ash. A new form of sand filled the air, one made, not by time, but by the slow grinding of hope. It was said that in some remote valley, a group of sun priests still waited. Every morning they stood upon their mountain shrine and sang the hymns of Ra. They believed that one day the veil would lift, and that Ra, hearing their song, would rise again. No one had seen them in moons. Perhaps they were real. Perhaps only a dream told by those too frightened to face the silence, without a story. As the year dragged on, and the veil showed no sign of retreat, people stopped looking up. What use was it to hope, to stare into a sky that no longer answered? Necks ached, eyes failed. The sky was no longer a place of dreams, but a lid, a prison, a ceiling without mercy. Egypt had turned its gaze downward toward the soil, the stone, the dying, embers of its own breath. And still, the veil remained. It began not with the fall of the gods, but with the shiver of those who served them. Priests who once moved with solemn grace, now fidgeted with the hems of their robes, their hands trembling as if seized by the same chill that haunted the land. The temples, once fortresses of faith and reason, had become echoing halls of uncertainty, where the sacred oil burned less brightly, and the scent of frankincense no longer masked the odor of fear. Even the carved idols seemed to lean inward, whispering secrets to the dust that now cloaked them like a funeral shroud. The high priest of Thebes stood at the altar of Amun-Ra, the god of sun and kingship, his voice rising in ritual praise. But there was hesitation between each syllable, a falter that had never lived in his voice before. As he extended his arms toward the sky, hoping for even a flicker of dawn, the black veil overhead made a mockery of the gesture. No sun answered. No warmth kissed his face. The sacred bird kept in the temple of Falcon, meant to carry the soul of Horus, refused to sing, its beak open in silence. The younger acolytes gathered behind their elders, clutching their scrolls and charms like weapons. They asked questions they were never supposed to ask. Why had the sun abandoned its chariot? Had Mat fallen, and with it, the balance of all things? Was this truly the end of the cycle, a return to the first darkness, when only chaos ruled? The elders answered with rebukes, but their eyes were restless. There was no script for what now unfolded, no ceremony designed for the vanishing of the sky. In Memphis, beneath the colossal statue of Ptah, artisans and sculptors brought offerings of tools, begging the god of creation to rebuild what had been broken. Their chisels were laid beside bowls of beer, their calloused hands smeared with ochre. But the god's eyes, carved from deep obsidian, reflected only their panic. The wind that blew through the temple carried ash, not answers. It swept their prayers away before they could reach the altar, scattering syllables like fallen leaves. In Abydos, where Osiris had been entombed and reborn for generations, the sacred festival of his resurrection was cancelled for the first time. In memory, no processions passed through the streets. No papyrus boats floated down the river, lit with tiny flames. The priestesses wept in private, unsure whether the god of rebirth had simply refused to rise, or if death itself had become permanent. In the quiet corridors of the temple, chants once echoed in harmony now. Only sighs filled the halls. There were murmurs of rebellion, even among the sanctified. A fringe group of priests from Karnak began preaching a new order of worship, claiming that the gods had turned against Egypt because of impurity. They demanded purges, sacrifices, purification through fire and blood. Some temples obeyed, others resisted. Within sacred walls, brothers turned against brothers, each clinging to a different fragment of broken belief. Panic cracked their unity. Like drought splits the earth, the fires of the eternal flame, kept alive by generations of temple guardians, flickered more violently with each passing day. Some said it was the lack of sunlight, others claimed it was divine wrath. When one flame extinguished unexpectedly in the temple of Thoth, scribes fell to their knees, believing that knowledge itself was being taken from the world. Ink began to fade on the scrolls, not from time, but from a growing dampness in the air that seeped into even the sacred text. In Heliopolis, the Temple of the Sun had always stood as a beacon. Its golden obelisk pierced the sky, a symbol of Ra's unfailing journey. But now the obelisk cast no shadow, and its shine dulled beneath layers of soot. The high priests debated if Ra had died, or if he had chosen to hide himself in the underworld. One aged prophet spoke of a new god, rising, devourer of light, long buried beneath the sands, now awakened by forgotten curses. His words were dismissed, but no one forgot them. Some of the faithful clung harder to their rites. They increased the hours of prayer. They fasted until their ribs showed beneath their robes. They lit fires every hour, whispering the 72 names of the gods into the smoke. But even their piety became suspect. Those who fasted too long were accused of sorcery. Those who wept during prayer were told to leave. The line between holiness and heresy blurred until no one knew if they stood on sacred ground or within a tomb. Among the common people, stories spread that the priests themselves had caused the sky's corruption, that they had performed a forbidden rite, or failed to complete a crucial offering. Some temples were stormed by the starving, seeking grain, warmth, even vengeance. The sacred doors, once opened only to the divine, were broken down by mortal hands. Statues were dragged from altars and hurled into the streets. Even gold, which once gleamed as proof of the god's favor, now looked cursed. In Eleusis, visiting priests from the Aegean shared similar tales. The sun had vanished from their lands as well. Their harvests failed. Their gods were silent. Together, they and the Egyptians formed uneasy alliances, blending rituals, exchanging sacred objects, desperately searching for some hybrid miracle that could pierce the darkness. But when a joint ceremony ended in a fire that collapsed half a temple roof, the alliance was quietly dissolved. Fear does not allow for sharing. Among the initiates, dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. They dreamed of temples submerged in blood, of stars blinking out like candles in a storm. Some claimed to speak with the gods in their sleep, but the messages were cryptic, filled with symbols and riddles. A young scribe awoke from one such dream, eyes wide with terror, whispering a name no one had heard in centuries. He died 3 days later, refusing to speak again. His tongue curled into a knot. The Nile priests, long trusted as interpreters of the river's will, began predicting floods that never came. When they cast sacred pebbles into the current, the water refused to carry them. When they read the flow of lotus petals, the patterns spoke only of stasis. One priest cut his own hand and bled into the river, hoping to awaken the spirit within. His blood swirled in silence. Nothing answered. The river, too, had gone mute. By the 6th month, the veiled sun, panic had become a ritual in itself. It had its own gestures, its own prayers, its own sacrifices. Temples were no longer sanctuaries, but theaters of fear. Visitors entered barefoot, silent, not from reverence but dread. No one wanted to offend whatever force now ruled the sky. The gods were not dead, they whispered. They were watching, and they were angry. In desperation, a coalition of temple elders devised a ritual never before attempted, a mass invocation of every major god, held under the same roof. 1,000 candles were lit, and every sacred name was carved into the stone. Smoke rose in spirals as drums thundered. Voices cried out, incense burned like fevered breath. But as the final name was spoken, the sky darkened further still, and a sudden gust blew out every flame. Panic became silence, and silence became certainty. When statues began to crack without touch, people said the gods were retreating into stone, turning their backs. Some believed the temples were becoming tombs, mausoleums for a dead world. Others began to dig beneath the altars, seeking secret chambers, hidden scrolls, forbidden truths. They found bones, they found silence, they found despair written in forgotten glyphs, warning not of punishment, but of abandonment. A traveling philosopher suggested the veil was not divine at all, that it was the sky itself decaying, that the sun had not left, but died. His words were met with stones. His body was never found. The idea, however, lingered. It festered like rot. For if the sun was mortal, then so were the gods. And if the gods could die, then all things sacred were illusions meant only to soothe a terrified world. Still, some held on to belief not because they were sure, but because disbelief offered no warmth. They lit lamps in their homes, shaped like lotuses, hoping the gods might recognize the symbol and send mercy. They carved prayers into the very walls, embedding language into the stone-like veins of hope. They taught their children hymns they barely remembered, so that the names of the divine would not vanish with the next breath. The panic that swept through the temples was not one of fire and screams, but of crumbling certainties, of rituals, performed with empty hands and uncertain hearts. It was a panic dressed in silk robes, weeping behind incense smoke, shivering in candlelight. The gods had not spoken, and in their silence, Egypt, the land of eternal order, drifted ever closer to chaos. They came not with hoofbeats or thunder, but with breath that slid beneath the skin, coiling like smoke around the mind. When the blackened sky became the ceiling of every home, and the sun no longer answered the prayers of priests or peasants, the people of Egypt began to hear them not with ears, but in the marrow of their bones. The demons did not announce themselves. They arrived in the silence between temple chants and in the pauses between desperate prayers, speaking only in fears that no one had yet named. Children were the first to sense them. Infants who once slept through the night began to wail without cause, eyes wide at corners of rooms where shadows curled unnaturally. Mothers clutched their swaddled ones to their breasts and whispered lullabies, now layered with trembling pleas. Some said they saw shapes beyond the columns of the house, thin, shifting forms with elongated limbs and no eyes, watching. Others claimed the demons whispered names of the dead in a voice that sounded like water running backwards. At night, entire villages sat awake, terrified of sleep. Dreams were no longer dreams. They became long corridors where time dissolved, where familiar faces turned to dust and spoke in reversed tongues. Even scribes, once revered for their clarity of thought, began to scratch nonsense glyphs into scrolls, twisted depictions of snakes with human teeth, women with hollow wombs, and black suns rising over rivers of flame. Some were found sitting motionless, their eyes glazed, their fingers still moving in the air, tracing words never meant to be read. In the damp underground chambers of Alexandria's lesser-known temples, whispers crept through the corridors like fog. Those who tended the oil lamps there reported hearing low voices arguing in languages no one could translate. A young attendant, alone one night, was found the next morning muttering a single phrase. He walks backward through time, over and over, until his voice cracked and bled. His mouth refused to close, held open by something that did not belong to this world. Among the peasant farmers, the stories grew darker. They spoke of fields that moaned when tilled and scarecrows that turned their heads at twilight. One man, bent with age, claimed he saw something crawl out of the earth beneath his barley, a creature with no skin, covered in eyes that blinked all at once. When he tried to speak of it at the village well, his tongue split in two. The others said it was punishment for bearing demon names in a holy place. But no one went near his land again. The demons were never uniform. In the desert, they were dust, things, spirits made of grit and wind, tearing at tents, whispering promises of shade that led travelers into oblivion. Along the Nile, they took the form of hissing reeds that spoke secrets no man should hear. In cities, they became reflections, faces that did not match the movements of those who cast them. Some even saw their own images blink while they remained still, and in that moment, a chill colder than death would settle into their bones. Holy men tried to cast them out. They brought fire, prayer, sacred oils, and the names of 100 gods. But the demons did not scream or retreat. They waited, patient. As wrought, they watched as the rituals grew louder, more desperate. In some temples, the demons began to speak back not aloud, but through the voices of the priests themselves. A chant would begin pure, and halfway through, turn into growls laced with profanity no one remembered teaching. The old gods were not defied, they were ignored. In homes, families began to hang carvings of unknown symbols on their doors, not the Eye of Horus, not the sacred ankh, but twisted glyphs drawn in charcoal or blood. These were passed from whispers to whispers, supposedly from survivors of encounters that should not have been survived. Some worked, others seemed to attract more whispers. A house that hung a wrong symbol was said to become hollow within a night, its occupants silent, their voices stolen and trapped in the walls, murmuring for release. The pharaoh's court, already fractured by hunger and confusion, fell into superstition. Advisors accused each other of inviting demons through cursed lineages. The palace itself was rumored to be haunted, its pillars sweating black water. At night, guards reported hearing music from unseen harps, laced with screams beneath the melody. One noblewoman vanished entirely, her chambers found torn from within, though the doors had remained sealed. In her bed, the sheets had been folded with perfect care. The madness spread faster than disease. Men in the street began to speak in tongues not known to the scholars. Women fell to their knees and claimed the earth beneath them had opened to reveal a different Egypt, one inverted, where demons ruled and gods were slaves. The line between vision and hallucination dissolved, and the people accepted both with equal fear. The world had become dreamlike, and in dreams, demons were as real as breath. Even the animals turned strange. Cats, once sacred and symbols of protection, began to vanish by the hundreds. Those that remained grew wild, staring at walls for hours, their tails flicking in unnatural patterns. Birds flew in broken spirals. Dogs would howl at noon, then fall dead, tongues swollen, eyes still wide with some unseen terror. The harmony between man and beast, once a core of mat, had unraveled, replaced with tension and trembling. In the libraries, hidden texts were unrolled. Forbidden scrolls, wrapped in tar and hidden behind false bricks, were read aloud in desperation. They spoke of other ages, when the sky was split and the demons ruled unchallenged. Some even named the current veil not as a natural disaster, but as the return of an ancient punishment. The darkness, they claimed, was not a symptom, but a doorway. A forgotten cult emerged from the edges of the Red Land, cloaked in ash and silence. They walked into cities offering protection. Their leaders bore tattoos shaped like inverted pyramids, and spoke of bargains to be struck. "Give us your tongues," they said, "and you shall never hear them again." Some took the offer, and indeed, those who did were never troubled by whispers again. But they also never spoke, or cried, or laughed not once. Their silence became their sanctuary, and their cursed. It was during one moonless night that a great tremor shook the temple of Hathor. The statue of the goddess split in half from head to breast, revealing inside not stone, but hundreds of embedded teeth, human and animal. The priests fell to their knees in horror. One ran into the courtyard, proclaiming Hathor had been devoured from within. He collapsed moments later, his veins black, his breath sulphurous. The temple was abandoned that day. Among the scribes, one began recording the whispers he heard. He wrote them by candlelight, using ink mixed with crushed beetle shells and wine. The scrolls filled quickly. He called it the Testament of the Hollow Ones. But after the 30th scroll, he was found with his hands fused together, his face buried in ink. The words he had written began to rearrange themselves overnight, forming patterns no one dared decode. The demons did not conquer by fire, nor by storm. They conquered through suggestion, seeping into minds, convincing the wise they were mad, and the mad that they were prophets. They fed on uncertainty, on the decay of order. They whispered that the gods had left long ago, and that this age of famine, ash, and shadows was the true form of the world, now unveiled. And the more people believed, the louder the whispers grew. A priestess from calm Umbu wandered into the desert, guided by voices promising clarity. She returned weeks later, her body skeletal, her eyes gone, replaced by two opals that shimmered with unnatural light. She did not speak. She simply stood, and from her silent presence, others began to hear voices. She became a living oracle, but one no one dared approach. It was said that even the sand recoiled where she walked, Fishermen along the delta claimed that the river no longer flowed from the mountains, but from beneath the earth, from a place they called the Crooked Waters. Their nets came up, filled with fish that had no eyes, and bones shaped like hands. They burned every catch they made, and still the river grew thicker, as if it carried not water, but memory and regret. The Nile was changing, whispering in gurgles. No one could unhear. Even the wind was no longer innocent. It carried voices with no source, and sometimes, in the briefest silence, the wind would pause, not die, but pause as if listening. And in that pause, the whole land would hold its breath, fearing the next gust might speak their name. For once a demon knew your name, it was said. It would never stop following you, even beyond death. And still, the whispers of demons did not shout or rage. They only lingered, patient and ancient, draped in the ash of a world unraveling. They needed no armies, they needed only time. And time, it seemed, was now theirs alone. When the winds carried not just the dust of desert storms, but the chill of a sunless world, even the boundaries of Egypt seemed to dissolve into something vaster and more terrifying. The calamity that had strangled the Nile and cloaked the temples was not theirs alone. In distant lands beyond the reach of the pharaoh's banner, beyond the pillars of Heracles and the snowy ridges whispered of in merchant tales, the darkness reached with equal cruelty. A shroud had been pulled over the world, and Egypt, once radiant, was now merely a flickering ember among many dying flames. In the north, the once rich granaries of Byzantium yielded little more than moldy husks. Their skies, too, bore the veil of smoke and ash, thick as river silt. Messages arrived slowly, etched onto brittle parchment carried by starved riders who could barely keep to the road. They brought words of famine in Constantinople, of looters dressed as monks, and of the sea itself turning green beneath a sky that no longer knew color. And the Egyptians listened not with awe, but with a dread that their affliction was not divine judgment, but part of something much older. From the Far East, where silk was born from worms and gold was woven into cloth, there came no caravans. The trade routes, once alive with camels and song, lay abandoned. Merchants spoke of entire cities buried under strange snowfalls, their temples icicles, and their people praying to suns that would never rise again. And yet, they also spoke of strange lights auroras, red as blood, slashing across the sky as if the heavens themselves had begun to bleed. To Egypt, such tales were once distant fiction. Now they echoed with horrifying familiarity. Rome's voice, already weakened by decay and splintered crowns, grew silent. Travelers who once carried oil and scripts from that great western ruin now bore only ghost stories. Fields were dead, they said, and mothers buried their sons with the same tired hands that planted useless seed. The eternal city had become a cemetery with broken columns as headstones. In Egypt, the scribes wrote this with shaking hands, knowing their own obelisks would soon mark graves no one would tend. And so the priests met by torchlight, no longer arguing over rites or incense, but whispering questions of survival. They looked at the scrolls, not to interpret stars or omens, but to search for mention of a sun that refused to shine. Even among the most ancient records, those hidden behind temple walls and sealed with curses, there were only vague tales of such darkness. One fragment from the time of the Old Kingdom spoke of the sky bleeding ash and 1,000 nights with no morning. It had been dismissed as poetry. Now it was prophecy. As the Nile grew sluggish and thick with decay, even the fish that once leaped from its waters now floated belly up, their eyes milky and mouths agape, and the people wondered if Egypt, land of divine rhythm and sunborn cycles, could falter. What hope remained for lands without such sacred order? For if the gods of the Nile could not hold back the sky's unraveling, then perhaps no gods could. And this thought, unspoken yet shared, drifted like smoke through the lungs of every city. In distant valleys where the snow never touched, snow began to fall. It was not the snow of myth, soft and white and pure, but grey, tinged with soot and heavy with something no one could name. It did not melt but lingered, like ash given weight by morning. It blanketed cities and forests alike, muffling sound and swallowing hope. And as these tales reached Egypt, the land of Ra began to understand that they were no longer witnessing an isolated curse. They were caught in a global dying. Beneath Alexandria's library, among the hidden annals of foreign tongues, scholars began comparing Note Syriac, Sanskrit, Latin, Coptic, Aramaic. The records matched. The sun dimmed in all lands. Crops failed. Plagues stirred. Even the stars seemed out of place. One scribe, white-haired and gaunt, pointed to an ancient passage that spoke of a veil cast by the tears of giants. Another referenced a distant mountain whose mouth belched darkness for 2 years. These were not metaphors. They were desperate attempts at understanding. Volcanosum said the cause was there. A mountain beyond the seas, known to some sailors as the throat of the world, may have ruptured, sending its entrails skyward to choke the heavens. But even this explanation gave little comfort, for it meant that the enemy was not punishment, nor demons, but the earth itself, turning against its own children. And what prayer could reverse such a wound? In China, rivers froze and crops withered. Great dynasties trembled as famine spread like a second shadow behind the sunless days. In India, rain ceased and kingdoms whispered of apocalypse. And still, in the heart of Egypt, mothers continued to light incense and hold their children close, whispering lullabies whose words had not changed for 1,000 years, but whose hope was no longer assured. The farmers, those who fed empires, now dug with hands raw and cracked, their tools rusted, their bellies tight with hunger. Children learned not letters, but silence, how to chew on roots and watch the skies for signs that never came. Even the festivals, once vibrant rivers of color and drumbeat, had become pale reenactments of memory. Statues were carried through empty streets, the hymns sung not with joy, but with the trembling cadence of mourning. Foreigners, who once came seeking wisdom, now brought only warnings. One man from the Aegean, sun-scarred and barefoot, collapsed at the gates of Memphis. Before dying, he spoke a single sentence in a broken dialect. "We saw the sun swallowed whole, and it did not scream." And with that, even the skeptics fell silent, recognizing that the world's pain had transcended borders, tongues, and faiths. The skies above Egypt held not just darkness, but weight. It was as if the heavens themselves leaned too close. There, sorrow pressing against the air, the birds flew lower, slower, as if reluctant to move at all. Time itself felt stretched, each hour dragging as if the day feared it would never become night, and night feared it would never become day again. The hours passed, but the days did not dot. In marketplaces, coins became meaningless. What mattered now were jars of grain, handfuls of dates, and clean water. Wealth was measured in sustenance, and power belonged to those who had stockpiled against the unknown. This too, Egypt learned from her neighbors, who sent word that kings now traded rubies for wheat, and scholars now begged at temple doors. Ships no longer crowded the delta. Their sails, once like stitched wings of 1,000,000 nations, had vanished. Trade routes dissolved, harbors grew silent, and Egypt, long proud as the crossroads of civilization, stood alone, watching a world unravel not at the edges, but at its center. Even the lighthouses burned dimly now, unsure if anyone remained to see them. Stories crept in of great beasts, migrating in reversed creatures from deep jungles, now roaming the edges of Mediterranean cities, confused, hungry, driven by instincts that no longer matched the seasons. Locusts arrived early, frogs drowned in dry wells. Nature, too, seemed unmoored, its clock broken and cast into the dark. Among the priests, a new question arose. If this darkness is global, then what does Egypt mean anymore? Are we still chosen, if all are equally cursed? Their answers came not from gods, but from silence. And so they began to write less about divinity and more about survival, how to preserve seed, how to ration light, how to build fires that resisted the damp rot now infecting every wooden beam. But amid all this darkness, a paradox bloomed. Some found strange clarity in shared suffering. Egypt's neighbors were no longer distant threats or rivals, they were mirrors. Across seas and deserts, the people of the world now wore the same haunted expressions, told the same stories of vanishing sun and vanishing hope. And this terrible unity was both a comfort and a curse. Hope, when it came, was faint and cautious. A child born beneath the black sky who laughed in her sleep. A single fig tree that bore fruit despite the frost. An old man who remembered a tale of a time like this, and how, eventually, the sun did return. These were not prophecies, only flickers, but they were enough to keep the Nile's people moving forward, if only one breath at a time. For Egypt had survived before plagues, floods, invaders, dynasties crumbling into dust. And though the world now mourned beneath a shared darkness, the spirit of those who carved pyramids and mapped stars still lingered. The plunge was global, but so, too, would be the struggle to rise again into a dawn that, though unseen, was not yet forgotten. The bodies that once walked slow and hollow through the dust of famine now began to fall where they stood, not from hunger, but from a sickness that arrived without trumpet or warning. It crept through the villages like a shadow under the door, silent, invisible, and final. At first it was dismissed as the toll of starvation, children coughing blood, elders too weak to rise, young men shivering despite the heedless sky. But then it began to leap, from house to house, from breath to breath, and Egypt understood famine had merely opened the gates for something worse. The temples, once echoing with chants and incense, now smelled of sweat and sickness. Priests in linen robes, who once washed in holy water and stood spotless before the gods, now wiped pus from blistered flesh and whispered prayers they had never been taught. They burned herbs, they chanted spells from crumbling scrolls, they placed amulets carved in desperate haste upon the necks of the dying. But the gods, if they still watched, gave no answer. Not even death had a pattern anymore. It came not for the weakest alone, but for those who had seemed strong. No healer could keep up. The scribes tried to catalogue symptoms: black boils along the jawline, rashes that spread like fire, eyes that turned yellow before shutting forever. The illness took many forms, some slow and choking, others fast and violent. They called it different names in different tongues: the ghost lung, the red rain, the night sweat, but all names led to the same end. Funeral pyres burned day and night along the Nile, their smoke curling into the sky as if trying to speak to the black sun that refused to shine. Cities festered, in narrow alleys of Thebes and along the cloistered courtyards of Memphis. The disease bloomed like rot. Families locked their doors, not to keep thieves out, but to keep breath in. When a neighbor coughed, fear followed. The wealthy, once shielded by walls and servants, found their riches no defense. Their linens became shrouds, their palaces mausoleums. Death paid no regard to status. A merchant and a beggar were buried in the same grave, covered by the same silenced art. In the granaries, where once the nation's lifeblood was stored, rats multiplied, drawn to the remnants of spoiled grain and unwashed bodies. They flourished, and with them came Flistini, unseen messengers of plague. They bit the sick and the healthy alike. What began as a famine-born weakness turned into a pestilence that had no beginning, no border, and no end. Rats scurried across altars, their red eyes gleaming with a hunger they could not name. River barges, once full of trade and laughter, now carried the dead. Their cargo was wrapped in cloth too thin to hold in the stench, and priests stood on the shores weeping, trying to recall rites from memory. For the scrolls had run out, and so had time. They no longer prayed for the living. They prayed for the souls to pass quickly, to avoid the netherworld's judgment. Even death had become crowded. In Alexandria, the scholars who once debated astronomy now collapsed in their libraries. Books were closed forever by hands too fevered to turn a page. The ink dried, the maps yellowed. One scroll, written by a dying scribe, read simply, "We have charted the stars, but not the darkness between them." He died with his head against a globe, whispering the name of a sun that no longer showed itself. Fear turned violent. In towns across the Nile's banks, accusations of sorcery rose. Foreigners were blamed. Old women with crooked spines and strange herbs were dragged into the street and stoned, their bodies left for the dogs. Even priests were not safe. If a god failed to protect his temple, then perhaps he was false. If a priest could not cure his followers, perhaps he was cursed. Truth and superstition became indistinguishable in the smoke. In some corners of Egypt, entire villages vanished, not conquered, not abandoned, but emptied by breath that simply ceased. Desert winds passed through doorways as if through bones. Pots sat untouched beside hearths, now cold. Chickens, the only survivors, pecked at the dust and crowed at nothing. And when travelers came upon these ghost towns, they turned away without speaking, afraid that to name such silence might invite it home with them. Doctors from distant lands arrived, only to perish. Syrian, Libyan, Greek, each man came bearing talismans, theories, and prayers. None left. They dissected the dead in secret, hoping to learn, but found only more mystery. Organs swollen, blackened, fluids that no longer resembled blood. They concluded what Egyptians already knew: this was not just illness, but collapse. The plague did not always kill swiftly. Some suffered for weeks, their skin pale and tight as linen, moaning through dreams they could not wake from. A woman was found singing lullabies to a child long dead in her arms. An old man dug his own grave, only to be found sitting beside it, waiting patiently for breath to leave. Madness came softly, wrapping minds in fog, just as it had wrapped the sun dot in sacred chambers. Desperate minds reached backward. They summoned forgotten rites, older than the pyramids, and scratched desperate symbols onto walls with coal and blood. Offerings were made to gods no longer worshipped, strange idols from the time before names. Some claimed it worked, more died screaming, and still the smoke from funeral fires rose, blotting even what little light remained. Along the canals, mothers drowned their children rather than see them starve or rot. Their bodies floated gently in the murk, faces peaceful, as if welcomed by the Nile herself. These were not acts of cruelty, but mercy as defined by a world gone mad. A priest found such a scene and wept, not for the dead, but for the world. That made their deaths seem kind. Trade was gone, hope was gone, but the disease remained. It did not ask for permission, nor offer explanation. It moved in rhythm with the wind, and knew no distinction between the land of Egypt and the realms beyond. Even the southern tribes, once believed safe, began to send cries for aid, cries that arrived too late, or not at all. Egypt, once the heart of the world, now bled with it. Records from this time are scattered and strange. Some speak of black rain, others of dreams filled with weeping suns and walking corpses. One tablet mentions a woman who glowed with fever and hovered 3 fingers above the ground before she died. Myths began where knowledge failed, and the people embraced them, for truth had brought them no safety. The royal court, once a place of precision and gold, now echoed with fear. Advisors argued, priests shrieked, servants fled. The pharaoh, weakened by fasting and grief, could do nothing but listen. He wore mourning robes each day, for every day brought new death. His throne became a cage, his country became a grave. Some sought escape into the desert, believing the dryness would save them, but the plague walked there too. Its breath lingered. In the sand, nomads collapsed beside their camels. Bones littered trails like forgotten offerings. And even the sun, when it did return for a brief glimpse, seemed afraid to linger. The disease entered the temples of Heliopolis, where Ra was once called to rise. There, too, it killed. Acolytes burned incense until the smoke choked them. Statues were smeared with blood in attempts to awaken sleeping gods. Nothing stirred, and so they abandoned the shrines, leaving Ra alone in the dark. And yet, some did not die. Against all reason, some bodies endured. A boy who nursed his infected sister and did not fall. A woman who breathed among corpses and sang lullabies until others joined her. From the ashes, something survived. Not because of prayer or medicine, but perhaps because the darkness, having taken so much, could not take everything. These were the seeds. Though they did not know it, they would become the beginning of the next story, the next chapter in Egypt's aching scroll. For even when disease walks hand in hand with famine, and darkness turns breath to silence, the Nile remembers how to rise again. Trade had once been Egypt's proudest artery, pumping goods, culture, and wealth from the far edges of the Mediterranean down to the southern cataracts of Nubia. Ships had glided across the Nile, their sails billowing like the wings of sacred birds, bearing oils from Phoenicia, cedar from Lebanon, glass from Rome, and lapis from the east. But when the sun faded and the sky darkened, those sails stilled. Harbors once filled with shouts, laughter, and song fell into unnatural quiet. The silence of trade became as loud as the drums of war. It began subtly. Foreign merchants arrived less frequently. Rumors whispered of storms that never ended, of sea captains who saw nothing but grey for weeks, of ships that vanished with no wreckage, as if swallowed by the clouds themselves. Egyptian ports like Alexandria and Pelusium, once glowing with the bustle of exotic goods and strange tongues, began to feel abandoned. Stalls were left unstocked. Traders waited on docks with coin but no cargo. Within weeks, scarcity bloomed like rot. First, the luxuries vanished: Persian incense, Syrian honey, fine glassware from the Greco-Roman world. Then, it was the necessities. Grain deliveries from buffer zones ceased. Papyrus shipments stopped. Even linen, grown on Egyptian soil but processed with dyes and tools from afar, became scarce. Prices soared. Barter returned. Coins became less valuable than a clean loaf or a dry match. The caravans that once snaked through the deserts like veins, bearing obsidian, spices, and metal ores, were raided more often. Desperation turned bandits bold, and without royal guards or payments to local tribes, safe passage disappeared. Entire caravans vanished. Their bones, both human and camel, were found weeks later, picked clean by vultures and wind. The desert offered no mercy to merchants now. In city centers, marketplace rituals crumbled. The careful dances of price and persuasion, once conducted beneath colorful awnings, became arguments soaked with fear. Traders accused each other of hoarding, of deceit, of witchcraft. Weavers fought over a single bale of thread. Mothers tore fruit from each other's hands. Guards no longer intervened. They were too underfed, too few, or too afraid of what violence might ignite. Egypt's inland economy fared no better. Farmers, once proud and self-reliant, had no seed to sow, no tools to repair, no draft animals to harness. Blacksmiths had no imported iron. Potters had no glaze. The interdependence that once made Egypt rich now made it fragile. Each profession leaned upon another, and when one fell, the rest followed like papyrus reeds in a flood. Boats that once delivered fresh catch and pottery between cities now floated half-submerged, their hulls cracked and crews gone. The boatmen, themselves those low-caste men of river knowledge, turned to thievery or vanished into the reeds. The Nile, always a bringer of life and movement, now reflected only the stillness of a dead market. The scribes, usually above the common strain of commerce, began to panic. Without ink, parchment, or wax, contracts could not be written. Debts could not be recorded. Laws were recalled only from memory, and memories faded in hunger. The pharaoh's tax collectors found themselves empty-handed, not from rebellion, but because there was nothing left to give. The priesthoods, dependent on offerings to maintain their temples, grew desperate. No more gold adorned their statues. No wine poured upon altars. Without trade, they could not import the sacred ingredients for ritual: myrrh, cinnamon bark, resins, rare stones. The gods, too, were starved, or so it seemed to those who believed. Craftsmen and artisans, the hands that once built the tombs of kings and carved stories into eternity, now found themselves idle, their skills suddenly worthless. A jeweler might still shape amulets, but who would trade grain for gold when their children screamed at night? And so they laid down their tools and watched their fingers grow soft from disuse and hunger. Even communication suffered. Without commerce, the flow of information slowed to a crawl. The knowledge of distant provinces, once carried by traders and sea captains, disappeared. In Lower Egypt, no one knew what plagued Thebes. In Nubia, rumors whispered of entire cities swallowed by smoke. Trade had been the nervous system of empire, and now that it was severed, the body trembled in confusion. Alliances formed from trade pacts collapsed. The neighboring kingdoms, once soothed with Egyptian grain and favor, now turned cold. With Egypt weakened and unable to pay tribute or provide wares, its influence waned. Ambassadors returned empty-handed. Treaties lay abandoned in empty halls. Where once Egypt had bought peace with goods, now it could offer only silence. Corruption bloomed in the vacuum. Officials hoarded what little moved through the markets. Warehouse doors stayed locked. A handful of grain could bribe a judge. Justice, like everything else, had a price that now only the powerful could pay, and the poor, denied bread, stole it. The jails overflowed until no one cared to arrest anyone at all. Counterfeit goods spread. Clay passed for stone. Sawdust filled sacks of flour. Oil was diluted with river water. Some desperate traders filled wine jugs with dye and vinegar, then vanished before morning. Even the sacred scrolls sold to pilgrims were sometimes blank. Trust, once the foundation of all exchange, had turned to Ashdod. The port city of Canopus, once bright with color and song, became a harbor for ghosts. Wooden beams cracked without repairs. Inns shut their doors. Brothels, temples, and bathhouses stood empty. Even the rats, once fat on spilled grain and fish, scurried thin and nervous. The air smelled not of salt and spices, but of mildew and decay. Egyptian currency lost meaning. With no goods to buy, and no confidence left in leadership, money became little more than metal weight. Barter systems emerged. but they too collapsed as scarcity grew. Eventually, trade was reduced to instinctual desperation, a tool for bread, a service for shelter, a stolen item for a single egg. Some tried to revive commerce. A few brave captains sailed despite the blackened skies, hoping the sea would spare them. But storms battered their sails, and when they returned, if they returned, it was with empty holds and haunted eyes. No trade route was safe. No merchant could swear that he would return. In villages along the Nile's edge, commerce transformed into something ritualistic, almost sacred. A loaf of bread passed from one hand to another was a ceremony. A thread of linen bartered for a clay cup was a moment of trust in a world unraveling. And yet, even these fragile acts grew rare as famine gnawed deeper. The pharaoh's treasury, once heavy with tribute and imports, echoed with absence. Gold sat useless in sealed rooms. The empire had built its bones on exchange of goods, of stories, of gods. Now it stood still, paralyzed by the absence of motion, of voices, of bargaining hands, a stillness that felt like death before the final breath. Children born during these years grew up never knowing the colors of foreign silks, the scent of eastern spices, or the voices of distant tongues. Their lullabies spoke not of riches, but of hunger and ghosts. To them, the old world was not a memory but a myth, a story. Older relatives whispered with hollow pride, and still, the Nile flowed, silent, as if waiting for the trade ships that no longer came, as if mourning what once was a world where a single boat might carry cinnamon and hope, where a market cry could fill the air like birdsong. And now, in the dim grey of 536, only echoes remained. The Nile had never failed them, not truly. It had been the ancient breath of Egypt, rising and falling like the heartbeat of the gods, flooding the plains with silt, so rich it could coax green from stone. It was not merely a river, but a divine cycle, a covenant between heaven and earth. But in the grey years, that sacred rhythm faltered. The waters came late, came low, or did not come at all. The people stared at the sluggish current with disbelief, as if the gods themselves had broken their promise. Priests blamed the dim sun, whose weakened light failed to stir the far rains of Ethiopia. Without those monsoons to swell the blue Nile, the great inundation shrank. Farmers watched as the river crept past their fields like an old man out of breath. It no longer spilled over its banks with joyful violence, but trickled uncertainly, exposing muddy scars where fish once leaped. The black earth of the floodplain cracked beneath the sunless sky, desperate for water that never arrived. In villages along the water's edge, canals turned stagnant. Irrigation systems, meticulously tended through generations, dried into dusty pathways. Oxen stood tethered before dry troughs, their tongues swollen from thirst. Fields of barley shriveled in neat rows, as if withering in synchronized mourning. Every seed planted beneath the ash-dark sky emerged, stunted or not at all. The bounty that once fed millions was now a ghost. With no flood came no silt, and without the dark, fertile silt, even the most skilled farmers were powerless. The Nile's failure wasn't loud like war or sudden like plague. It was slow, hollow, and intimate. It entered homes as hunger, crept into conversations as unease. Men who once whispered prayers of thanks at harvest now wept over furrowed ground. The gods were not listening, or worse, they had turned against them. In cities like Memphis and Thebes, granaries emptied with terrifying speed. Scribes who once kept careful records of abundance now documented absence. No carts lined up outside city gates with offerings. The annual accounting ceremonies became mournful rituals, led with trembling hands and dry voices. The high priest of Hopi, once surrounded by music and flower garlands, now performed rites in silence before a dry altar. The poor suffered first. With no food to gather or beg, they scavenged the margins of the city, eating roots, leaves, and even clay. Mothers brewed broth from weeds. Some ate insects and worms, once considered unclean, now rebranded as survival. Rumors swirled of graver acts, whispered in alleys and behind shuttered doors. Desperation made beasts of once gentle neighbors. And then the Nile turned cruel. In places it foamed strangely, choked with dying fish. The priests declared it a punishment, a sign of impurity. People lined the banks in silence, watching bloated fish drift by like omens. Some cast prayers upon the water, others, stones. The river they once revered as divine had become an uncertain mirror, showing them not blessings, but decay. Crocodiles grew bold in the hunger. Deprived of fish and prey, they lurked closer to villagers, dragging livestock and children into the reeds. Where once these beasts were symbols of divine strength and balance, they now seemed like demons set loose by the dying river. The people feared the Nile not just for its absence, but for the monstrous hunger that filled its emptiness. On desperation, some turned to forbidden rituals, forgotten blood rites dredged from the corners of ancient scrolls. Offerings made in secret, not to the Nile's nurturing spirit, but to darker forces believed to dwell beneath its surface. Fishermen left goats at the shore. In the dark of night, some whispered that even human offerings returned sacrifices made by the truly mad or truly desperate. The river, they said, was thirsty not for water, but for souls. The pharaoh's court, isolated and still feasting on its dwindling stores, sent decrees, increase prayers, expand the canals, blame the Nubians, blame the Hittites, blame the sins of the people. But no edict could summon rain in Ethiopia. No royal command could coax the waters to rise. The Nile bowed only to the sky, and the sky had gone silent. Scribes began revising the sacred calendars. Without the flood, the months lost their rhythm. Festivals meant to celebrate abundance became funerals in disguise. The Feast of the Valley, once a procession of flowers and song, was a slow parade of grief. Offerings to Osiris, god of rebirth and fertility, became pleading cries for just a drop of mercy. In the delta, farmers watched salt creep into the soil as the sea pressed inland. Without the Nile's mighty push, brackish tides flooded the channels. Crops failed not from drought but from poison. The river, their protector, had abandoned its post. The very shape of Egypt, long defined by its balance of land and water, began to deform. Boats sat stranded in cracked docks. The famed river traffic slowed to a crawl, carrying not goods, but refugees. Whole families drifting southward in search of rumors that deeper in Upper Egypt, the Nile still flowed, that a village still fed its children. Most found only more silence. The Nile's betrayal had no boundary. It touched every shore. Stories changed. Where once children learned of the Nile's blessings in lullabies, they now heard of its anger in cautionary tales. Obey the gods, or the river will vanish. Step too close, and it will take you. What had been Egypt's great comfort became its most terrifying question. What do you do when the one thing that always gave life begins to take it? The temples to Hopi, the Nile god, grew overgrown and empty. No flowers adorned the statues. No songs echoed in their chambers. In desperation, priests from different faiths gathered, mixing chants and sacrifices, hoping to awaken something, anything that would bring the waters back. But the silence remained, deep and echoing. Scholars began to argue. Was this the end foretold in old scrolls? Was the world truly dying? Or was it a test, a punishment for pride, a cycle of destruction before rebirth? But these questions held no grain, no clean water, no shelter. Philosophy could not plow fields, theology could not fill bellies, and the Nile remained unmoved. In the south, near Aswan, some small tributaries still trickled. Communities huddled there like moths around the last dying flame. They rationed everything: water, light, hope. Outsiders were turned away or killed. The river was no longer a public god, but a secret inheritance, a prize for the few, a myth for the many. Eventually, people stopped waiting. They left the river altogether, wandering into the desert, heading east toward the Red Sea, or west toward the oases, but few returned. The desert was never meant to be home. The Nile had always been the spine of Egypt. Without it, the body scattered. The limbs lost their strength, and through it all, the Nile did not speak. It did not surge with rage, nor withhold with malice. It simply changed, indifferent to the suffering it left behind. The people wept for it, prayed to it, feared it, but the river flowed, or didn't, with a silence deeper than the tomb. He was once the axis of Egypt's world, the divine son of Ra, whose breath was law, whose word moved armies and calmed gods. The pharaoh had sat beneath golden canopies, face untouched by wind or hunger, wrapped in incense and divine titles. His presence alone could still a crowd or spark 1,000 craftsmen into labor. But in the cursed year, as the Nile failed and the skies dimmed, even his shadow began to retreat. The throne did not tremble, it grew empty. The man beneath the crown became a rumor, a flicker behind layers of linen and guarded doors. At first, the absences were subtle. He missed one appearance at the temple procession, then two. His voice, once heard daily in court, was replaced by scribes reading decrees in his name. Rumors whispered that the royal physicians had taken Elor. Worse, that the pharaoh himself no longer rose from bed, but no one spoke too loudly. The air in the palace thickened with secrecy. Even the pigeons that carried messages from Thebes to Memphis were fewer now. Their journeys too dangerous, their fates too uncertain. Behind the palace's veiled screens, servants gossiped in halftones. They had not seen their king in days. Meals brought to his chambers returned untouched. A priest of Sekhmet claimed the pharaoh was sick with a wasting fever, but others murmured that he had seen the darkness in the sky and gone mad. There were no confirmations, only closed doors and long silences. The pharaoh's silence became a kind of power, heavy and cold, like stone that had forgotten warmth. The court clung to protocol, still painting his image on scrolls and reliefs, still addressing him as if he stood before them. But behind the formality lay doubt. If the king did not act, if he did not speak, could he still be pharaoh? And if he was not, who was? The viziers grew bolder, each interpreting his will differently. One sent soldiers north to seize grain. Another ordered sacrifices in Thebes. The empire no longer moved as one body, but as a severed limb, twitching. Without thought. In marketplaces, the people spoke of omens. A falcon was found dead on the temple steps. A statue of the king cracked at the brow. The sun itself had abandoned them. Was it because the pharaoh had as well? Was he dead? Cursed? Had he fled into the desert to seek answers from ancient spirits? Some said they had seen him wandering the city in disguise, weeping beneath a hood. Others swore he had transformed into a jackal or a shadow, punished by the gods for Egypt's sins. The royal family grew silent. Queens and concubines vanished behind silken curtains. Their once frequent appearances halted. His eldest son was said to have taken ill. His daughter's chamber, once filled with music, was now quiet. The line of divine inheritance, once so carefully guarded, frayed like old linen. The dynasty that had stood unbroken for generations now trembled on the edge of forgetting. What is a king, the people wondered, who cannot be seen, who cannot be heard? The temples, once the pharaoh's allies, now debated openly. Some priests claimed the gods had chosen a new line. Others declared the pharaoh had transcended the physical world and ruled from the divine plane. In shrines across the Nile, offerings were split, half to the old king, half to potential successors. The unity of Egypt's soul began to split along cracks in belief. Faith, like food, had become rationed. In private, the old priests of Pata dusted off scrolls of precedent. What to do when a pharaoh vanishes? They found only half-myths and ritual scripts, vague poems about god-kings who disappeared into stars or dissolved into stone. No answer was satisfying. No rite brought the crown back to life. The sacred balance, the mat tipped slowly into chaos. The people felt it in their bones. In the streets, mock kings rose. One man in Memphis crowned himself in a stolen headdress and declared a new reign. Another, in Abydos, claimed to channel the pharaoh's spirit through sleep. These pretenders were often dragged through the streets and stoned or silenced in dark cells, but each left behind a scar. Their followers believed, and belief, in desperate times, was more powerful than reason. The royal guard, uncertain of their orders, grew restless. They patrolled more fiercely, not to protect, but to silence. Those who asked too many questions vanished. Whispers in taverns led to beatings. Scribes, who spoke of the pharaoh's silence, were found with their ink pots spilled across their faces. Fear became the new royal seal, pressed upon lips, burned into memory. In some regions, governors declared independence. With no visible pharaoh, they claimed the right to rule themselves. Taxes went unpaid. Temples closed. The great chain of tribute that once flowed like blood to the heart of Egypt slowed, then stopped. Egypt, the land of order and cycles, became a map of islands, isolated, suspicious, hungry. Unity faded, not with a war, but with silence. Even the tomb builders stopped their work. The great necropolis in the west, always prepared for the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife, lay half-carved. They did not know what form to prepare for. Was he to be buried, mummified, deified, or had he already passed into legend, into nothingness? Without certainty, the chisels paused. The hammers quieted. Dust settled where gold was once shaped. Children no longer learned his name by heart. The songs of the pharaoh, sung for generations, were replaced with lullabies about darkness, hunger, and strange stars. The palace became a symbol not of grandeur but of absence. Its walls loomed, its windows stared blankly. Even the birds avoided its courtyards. A kingdom ruled by emptiness had no need for music. And still, the people waited. Some prayed he would return with light in his eyes and power in his step, to banish the famine and scatter the ash. Others feared what might return, if anything at all. Could a man survive such silence? Could a king? Could he be the same? Eventually, the people began to fill in the silence themselves. Artists carved statues of what he might now look like, some divine, others monstrous. Poets wrote verses imagining his dreams, his fears. A blind beggar in Heliopolis swore the pharaoh had spoken to him through the wind. An old woman in Elephantine claimed to see his face in the moon. The absence had become a canvas for everything they feared and hoped, and still, no word came. Years passed. The pharaoh's name was scratched from some walls, painted over in others. His statues were left untended, pigeons nesting in their golden crests. His cartouche, once stamped on every jar and ledger, faded. The vanishing had not been one moment, but a slow eclipse. He had ruled, and then he had not. Egypt had believed in him, and then it had dreamed of him. No tomb bore his name, no coffin held his bones. His soul, if it still moved, was lost between worlds. A shadow that had once worn a crown. Even as the Nile's murmur faded, and the sun hid behind veils of ash, there were those who turned not forward but backward toward the tombs, toward the stone echoes of rulers long gone. The people began whispering old names, names once etched into sandstone and gold: Djoser, Khufu Senusrit, Hatshepsut. In their silence, those ancient kings seemed louder than the vanishing pharaoh, more real than the ghost of a monarch who ruled only through absence. Their statues, though weather-worn, stood tall, and in their unmoving eyes people sought answers to a dying present. Pilgrimages began not toward temples of the living gods, but toward necropolises forgotten. The Valley of the Kings, once solemn and guarded, now teemed with desperate feet. Women laid bread before fated tombs. Priests whispered incantations last recited centuries ago. Speak to us, they begged the dead. Tell us how you survived the darkness. Tell us what to do when the gods have stopped answering. These long silent kings, buried with their gold and prayers, were asked to guide the starving and the blind. Some claimed they received visions brief, flashes of a long-dead pharaoh walking among the dunes, wrapped not in linen but in darkness. Others said a tomb had begun to weep, and that salt stains like tears rolled down the face of a queen's statue. The past was not history anymore, it was company. The present had grown too thin, too brittle, so the people leaned into memory, where kings never vanished, and crops never failed, and the sky remained blue above the red land dot in Memphis. An old man swore that the spirit of Thutmose III had entered his body. He began preaching outside the broken gates of the temple, his voice cracked but filled with fury. He spoke of discipline, of war, of the blood offerings that once kept Egypt strong. Dozens gathered daily, not because they believed, but because they wanted something to believe in. The man ate little, and his ribs grew sharp beneath his skin, but his eyes burned with something beyond hunger. In Thebes, a former scribe began translating ancient tablets left unread for centuries. He believed the kings of the 6th dynasty had left prophecies hidden within their burial texts, instructions for how to restore the order of the world when Mat had fallen. His fingers bled on the sharp edges of stone. His eyes swelled from lamp smoke. He read feverishly, ignoring the collapse of his own roof. When asked why, he only said, "The dead remember what we've forgotten." The temples began reviving ceremonies, older than living memory. Bull sacrifices returned. Priests painted their eyes in the style of the Old Kingdom. Forgotten goddesses like Nekhbet and Meretzger were invoked beside Isis and Hathor. It was not so much worship as desperation, an attempt to shake the bones of the past awake. If the present was a curse, perhaps the past could bargain with the gods on their behalf. Children were renamed after long-dead pharaohs. A mother named her starving son Akhenaten, hoping the name would ward off disease. Another swaddled her daughter and whispered the name of Cleopatra, not for beauty, but for survival. The lines between memory and myth blurred. The dead walked, in words, in names, in gestures, in dreams. Some said, The ancient kings walked against her and sorrowful, their arms raised toward a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. The artisans of Saqqara returned to work, not to carve new tombs, but to repair the old ones. Paint was mixed from dust and rust. Broken faces were patched with clay. A sculptor, old and blind in one eye, recarved the lips of a forgotten queen, saying, "Let her speak again, and maybe the world will listen." There was reverence in the touch, but also urgency. It was no longer about honoring the dead, it was about surviving with their help. A strange kind of cult rose among the people, a cult of dynasties, not gods. They carried no idols of Osiris or Amen, but wore fragments of broken Oshapti figures around their necks. They chanted the lineage of kings like a protective spell. To them, the ancient line was divine. The pharaohs were not men but anchors, their legacy holding Egypt's soul together. Now, in absence, that soul drifted, and they clung to what still had weight, the names etched deepest in stone. The scholars argued whether this reverence was blasphemy or piety. One wrote on a scrap of papyrus that Egypt was like a snake eating its own tail, feeding on its own past to endure the present. Another replied that it was better to eat memory than ash. Still another said that perhaps the ancient kings had never truly died, and that in such darkness, their long shadows simply became more visible. But not all echoes were comforting. In the catacombs of Abydos, some tombs had been disturbed, bodies stolen, gold stripped. A priestess was found mutilated. Beside a broken sarcophagus, people whispered that the dead were angry, not grateful, and that memory could also curse. A boy claimed he had seen the face of a long-dead king floating in a basin of water, smiling with rotten teeth. The past was alive, yes, but perhaps not. Kindly. The royal cartouches of old pharaohs began to appear graffitied onto walls in modern slums. Not as insults, but as talismans. A faded carving of Ramses was ringed in fresh prayers. "Protect this house," someone had written beneath it in trembling script. The old kings were being made into saints of suffering. Their dignity became shield, their silence became answer. They were the only rulers who did not abandon the people. One day, near the ruins of Amarna, a shepherd unearthed a seal bearing the name of Ak. He ran to the city, clutching it like a jewel. The priests debated its meaning for weeks. Some believed it was a sign that Aten, the old sun god, would rise again. Others called it a Trapakanaten, had brought chaos once, and perhaps the earth was offering him up as a warning. Either way, the shepherd was found dead days later, his mouth filled with mud. In villages near the desert edge, storytellers gathered children and told the tales of dynasties past, not in the old formal verses, but in weeping tones, as if each story were a requiem. They spoke of battles won and temples raised, of rivers that never failed, of kings who spoke with gods. And the children, eyes wide in the dark, asked why those kings had left them. No one could answer. The statues of ancient rulers, once gazed at with reverence, began to feel different. Some said their eyes followed you, not with pride, but pity. Others believed the stone lips muttered in the night. Whether it was madness or grief, the boundary between past and present no longer held. Egypt had become a land of hauntings, where the living prayed to be remembered by the dead. Not all who looked back were content. A rebel group formed in the southern deserts, calling themselves the Sons of Set. They believed that the dynasties of the past had cursed Egypt with their arrogance, and that only by erasing them stone, name, and memory could the land be cleansed. They burned reliefs, shattered temples. In doing so, they tried to silence the ghosts. But even fire could not erase what was already etched in soul and sand. In the capital, a scribe wrote that Egypt no longer had kings, only echoes, that each breath the people took was borrowed from those who came before, that in such a world, survival was not living, but remembering. He placed the scroll in a jar and buried it beneath a dead tree. He hoped someone would find it one day, when the air was clear again, and the stars had returned. The present moved in loops now, each ritual a recreation of older ones, each prayer laced with forgotten names. Even the plague doctors began wearing masks modeled on ancient deities, half believing that Anubis might guide them through the rot. The past had become both armor and burden, clinging like linen in the humidity of decay. And still, the land did not heal. The Nile remained low, the granaries hollow, the pharaoh absent, the gods silent. But the old kings, their names grew louder, in every whispered prayer, every broken tablet, Every child named for a legend they rose, not to rule again, but to be remembered when all else had crumbled. When the sky lost its color, and the Nile no longer swelled with the breath of the gods, the temples became prisons of unanswered prayer. Within their sacred walls, the priests struggled not only with failing rituals, but with the terrifying silence that followed each supplication. Where once their voices echoed in grand halls, summoning the divine with music, incense, and precise rites, now only dust replied. The sacred flame at Karnak flickered, starved of oil. The incense ran dry, offerings spoiled before the gods touched them. The divine order mat was unraveling, and the priests feared it had turned its face away. Every morning they awoke in sweat-drenched linens, dreams invaded by black waters and broken statues. Still, they clung to routine. They bathed in cold, brackish pools, purified with bitter natron, and adorned themselves in linen robes that hung looser with each week of fasting. They chanted the same hymns, even as their throats cracked and their voices strained. It was no longer a performance for the gods, it was an exorcism of despair. Without the rituals, their identity collapsed. Without the gods, they were merely men in hollow shells of stone. Hierophants debated deep into the fading nights whether the collapse was punishment or a test. One elder proclaimed that Amen was angry, betrayed by Pharaoh's neglect. Another countered that Ra had withdrawn behind the black veil as judgment, not wrath. A younger priest, too bold for his station, whispered that perhaps the gods were dead. A silence fell in the hall, heavier than lead. The high priest slapped him to the floor and exiled him from the inner sanctum. But in private, none could deny that the possibility had lodged like a splinter in their minds. In the house of life, scribes struggled to replicate ancient texts by torchlight. Papyrus was running scarce, and ink had to be stretched with water that reeked of rot. The priests transcribed the rituals word for word, even as they no longer believed in their efficacy. They wrote spells for protection against plague, famine, and death, but even the ink seemed reluctant to flow. One scribe reported that a beetle had emerged from his scroll, mid-script, and taken wing with a shrill hiss. He saw it as a curse, a sign that Thoth himself was abandoning his scribes. Outside the temple walls, the commoners grew restless. They brought their sick children, their dead livestock, their broken idols, and demanded miracles. The priests could only offer platitudes and dry prayers. When nothing changed, stones replaced prayers. One temple was set ablaze by a mob that believed the gods were being hoarded by the elite. A novice burned to death trying to save a statue of Sekhmet. His screams, some said, were more honest than any hymn. Even within the priesthood, division, gruesome, called for more blood sacrifices, oxen, birds, even people arguing that the gods required louder offerings. Others recoiled, fearing they would only anger the divine further. A schism formed between those who clung to tradition and those willing to adopt forbidden rites, pulling fragments of Nubian, Canaanite, and even Hittite spells into their rituals. In desperation, purity crumbled, and with it, so did unity. A secret rite was held in Abydos by rogue priests who believed Osiris could be summoned directly. They performed the old rebirth mystery, not as a reenactment, but as a true invocation. They buried one of their own alive, chanting that he would rise as the god-king. He did not. Days later, the temple floor cracked, and an acrid stench filled the holy chamber. No god appeared, only decay. The high priest of Heliopolis, once radiant in golden robes, now walked barefoot, speaking in riddles. He claimed to hear the voice of Ra in the silence, warning of a darkness deeper than death. Even the sun must rest, he muttered, scratching symbols into the walls. Some called him mad, others a prophet. He stopped eating, surviving only on date wine and dried lotus root. On the seventh day, he vanished. His sandals remained by the altar. No one found his body. Women began joining the priesthood again, not as dancers or servants, but as full ritual leaders. The old laws prohibiting them were ignored, as death made nonsense of hierarchy. One priestess, Neferka, claimed to channel the voice of Hathor. She led processions into the desert, singing lullabies to the stars. The dying followed her, believing that if they perished beneath her voice, they would rise in the field of reeds. Her songs were haunting, sweet, and soaked in sorrow. A few priests turned inward, retreating into tombs to fast and meditate beside the dead. They believed that only through communion with ancestors could the divine be remembered. Some emerged days later speaking in broken phrases of ancient dialects. Others never emerged at all, becoming offerings themselves, sacrifices, to a forgotten age. Their skeletons were later found with lotus crowns, still resting on cracked skulls. The granaries attached to the temples emptied faster than prayers could refill them. Priests once fed by royal decree now stood in line with beggars. In Memphis, a sacred ibis was slaughtered by starving acolytes, roasted and shared in silence. The next day, the temple flooded not with water, but with ash and rats. Some called it coincidence. Others cried blasphemy. Whispers spread that the gods had chosen new servants, not in the temples, but in the wild places. Hermits, madmen, oracles appeared in remote oases claiming visions. One said he had seen Mat weeping at the edge of the world, her feather torn. Another claimed to have seen Set laughing beside a throne made of black glass. The temples dismissed them as frauds, but their followings grew. A storm shattered the roof of a sanctuary in Elephantine, destroying the shrine of Cunum. The river priests wept openly, seeing it as a death knell. Without Cunum, who shaped human souls on his potter's wheel, what hope remained for rebirth? Still, they rebuilt, stacking stone with bleeding hands, their prayers cracked and furious. "If you will not shape us," they shouted, "we will shape ourselves." Inside the libraries, sacred scrolls were locked away, not to preserve them, but to prevent their theft or misuse. The priests feared that commoners would try to wield divine knowledge like a weapon. In truth, many scrolls were already damaged and faded, corners gnawed by vermin, spells incomplete. The magic of writing had begun to fail. Glyphs blurred, even under the most careful hand, as if Thoth himself was withdrawing the language from the world. Priests of Anubis reported strange anomalies. Bodies, once embalmed with care, now decayed rapidly, skin sloughing before burial rites could complete. Mummification failed. The dead refused to rest. One funeral was interrupted when a wrapped corpse screamed from its linen, breaking the minds of 3 novices. Rumors swirled that the veil between worlds had torn, that even the duat was in disarray. A faction emerged, calling themselves the Keepers of the Final Breath. They abandoned temples, donning black robes, and walked from village to village offering end-of-life blessings. They believed that death was now the only certainty the gods allowed. No light, no Nile, no king, they whispered, but always the end. Some welcomed them, others saw them as vultures, but they were never turned away. In a final act of desperation, the High Council convened in every surviving temple sent representatives. Old enemies sat side by side, their eyes hollow, their incense burnt to the wick. They debated for days, whether to abandon the temples, to rewrite the rites, to declare the gods fallen and the age over. Some wept, others screamed. In the end, nothing was decided. Silence was the loudest vote. They returned to their cities, to broken altars and shrinking congregations. Yet still, every dawn, the priests climbed the steps of their sanctuaries. They lifted their arms toward a sun they could not see, and spoke the words they were born to speak. Not because they believed anymore, but because if they stopped, something far worse might take their place. They were born into silence. No lullabies cradled them to sleep. No full breasts calmed their cries. The winds that whistled through the skeletal palm groves were their only songs, and dust their constant companion. These were the children of hunger, conceived in famine, weaned on absence, raised beneath a sun that no longer warmed. Their bellies were round with emptiness, their eyes too large for their withered frames. They moved like shadows, barefoot and slow, learning early that motion consumed too much energy. Their mothers had once sung praises to Hathor during birth, believing she protected infants. Now, they whispered no names. Names were hope, and hope was treason in this age. They wrapped their babies in scraps torn from old temple robes, the linen sacred once, now just cloth against the cold. Few infants survived long enough to see a second floodless season. Those who did were rarely whole-scarred by disease, blinded by infection, their limbs brittle, their growth stunted. Yet they endured, gnawed by life rather than embraced by it. The older ones scavenged, not in the fields, for those were barren, but in the tombs and trash heaps of the cities. They learned to tear copper wire from fallen amulets, grind the last crusts of dried bread into powder, and trade fingernails and teeth from corpses for a single fig. They crept beneath the foundations of crumbling villas, drank water collected in skulls, and ate roots that made their stomachs boil. Still, it was more than what the priests gave, or what their kings, if any, remained, offered from behind their distant, cracked walls. When a mother died, the children wept, not out of sorrow, but fear. A mother's body could be warmth for one more night, or meat for one more meal. The most desperate among them, those with no older sibling to protect them, learned to love death, not as a thief, but as a giver. When an elder passed, the village would burn sandalwood, not in mourning, but to cover the smell. Some families refused burial entirely. Earth was too sacred to give to the dead when the living had no bread. They told stories, these hungry children, with dry lips and broken teeth, not of kings and gods, but of creatures made of smoke and soot that stalked the night, taking those who cried too loudly. They spoke of an invisible hand that fed one child and starved another, of the feather that would never balance against their guilt. One girl, half blind and unable to walk, was believed to have seen the god Sobek crawling through the canals. She said his eyes were bleeding, and he asked for a child in exchange for fish. 2 days later, the canal bubbled with silver. They carved dolls from clay and bone, not for comfort, but to bury them when siblings died. Sometimes the dolls wore human hair. Sometimes they were all that remained when plague came too fast. The children buried their dead in sand dunes, whispering fake names so the spirits wouldn't return. If the winds uncovered the bodies, they reburied them without a word. They knew the rituals better than the priests. No incense, no spells, just quiet and dirt, and a little stone to keep the dead from floating. Many had never seen the Nile. They only knew its absence, heard from elders, who spoke of a river that once sang. They played with bones instead of sticks, threw stones at vultures instead of birds. A game among them involved blindfolds and silence, pretending to be corpses. Whoever stayed still longest won. There was no laughter in this, only practice. One boy, born without fingers, was believed to be cursed. He wandered the settlements with his arms out, like a ghost. Yet he found food more often than others, and always shared it with a blind girl who never spoke. The people said he had no tongue either, though that wasn't true. He simply had nothing left to say. When he died in his sleep, they buried him beneath an old sycamore tree, and the tree bloomed for the first time in years. That year, no one starved in his village. Some children joined the keepers of the final breath, learning to chant in low tones and offer comfort to the dying. Their voices had not yet deepened, and their presence was strange, neither innocent nor threatening, only still. They would sit beside the sick, holding hands until the breathing stopped. When they left, they carried only feathers and stones. Some believed they had become priests of the new world, priests of hunger and silence. Others turned feral. Packs of children, wild-eyed and barefoot, raided shrines and grain stores, clawed at travelers, and danced under the moon in chalk circles. Their skin was painted in ash, their teeth sharpened on rocks. They worshipped no gods, only survival. Adults feared them more than beasts. They knew no mercy, but they knew fairness. They always shared their spoils among each other, and if one died, they all mourned with a strange, rhythmic howl. Once, a caravan from the desert brought dried dates and honey. The children swarmed them, not with pleading, but with knives of sharpened bone. The traders fled, leaving behind only torn satchels. The children devoured the feast, then vomited in unison. Their stomachs could not handle richness. Still, they laughed. It was a short-lived joy, but joy nonetheless. The temples began to fear the children. Statues were found broken, with small handprints smeared in red on their faces. Hymns were interrupted by ghostly giggling. One morning, the high altar was found covered in withered flowers and teeth. A priest declared it a curse. Another wept. He said it was a gift, the most honest offering they'd seen in moons. No one taught them to read, but they learned the symbols. The eye, the crook, the feather. They drew them in dust, sometimes backward. They created their own glyphs, marks of hunger, of sorrow, of lost names. They etched these onto walls with fingernails, onto their arms with shards. A child's wrist became a scroll, a record of every sibling they'd lost. When she died, her arm was cut off and buried separately, so the names would not vanish. A few elders began teaching again, but not arithmetic or poetry. They taught how to find clean moss, how to tell a snake bite from a scorpion's, how to hear the difference between a death cry and a birth scream. These were the lessons now. When one boy asked what a king was, the elder paused, then said, "A man who used to eat every day." The children nodded. They understood. They no longer feared death. It came like a nap, a heavy curtain over tired eyes. One child, pale as ivory, said she could see her siblings in her dreams, healthy, full, playing in fields. She begged not to be woken when she died. Her mouth was smiling, and the entire village carried her body in silence. They laid her in the roots of the oldest tree and whispered, "Take her home." Some children survived. Some grew. Thin reeds that bent with every wind, but did not break. They learned to grind stones into powder to make bitter bread. They raised goats from the wild, and when rain returned, they caught it in broken jars. They spoke little, but in their silence they listened to the earth, to the ghosts, to the gods who had not yet returned. And when one boy, now older, stood before the shattered gates of a ruined city and saw a lone sunflower pushing through the stone, he did not cry. He only knelt, kissed the dirt, and whispered, "Let the next children remember more than hunger." Memory lingered like a fog no wind could sweep away. It hung over the villages, the broken palaces, the dust-slick temples, creeping into the lungs of the living. No priest commanded it, no king could rewrite it, and no god dared silence it. It was not carved into stone, but etched into faces, into hollow stares, and lips bitten raw. The people walked through the ruins of the old world, not as mourners but as fragments themselves. Each soul a sarcophagus of what once was. The elders, once keepers of stories and seasons, now whispered their memories like confessions. They spoke of colors of ochre walls and cobalt amulets, of green reeds dancing along the Nile's edge. But their listeners, born beneath the ash skies, could not imagine color. To them, memory was madness, a dangerous nostalgia that stole strength from survival. Still, the elders persisted, clinging to recollections like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Inside one collapsing estate, a woman slept beside painted walls that told of a wedding held 50 years ago. She was the last of that house, and every night she recited the guest list aloud to keep them alive, each name a ward against forgetting. The frescoes above her peeled in silence. No one else remembered who those names belonged to, but she believed the dead stayed quieter if they heard their names spoken. Children avoided the oldest trees not for fear of beasts, but because they carried too many memories. Beneath those gnarled branches, men had been crowned, executed, and wed. Beneath them, mothers once prayed and slaves once sang. Now, the trees stood mute, unable to flower, unable to rot. The children threw stones at them, as if trying to knock loose a forgotten truth. Sometimes, a stone hit just right, and bark flaked away to reveal a symbol or scratch a date, a name, a cry for help. The temples had become tombs, not just for the dead, but for memory itself. Scrolls lay untouched in broken urns, and golden inscriptions flaked into dust with every wind. No scribe dared read them aloud anymore. Words were dangerous now. They summoned images, and images summoned grief. One boy tried to sing an old hymn, and his voice cracked into sobs before he could finish. His mother struck him across the mouth, not out of anger, but fear of remembering too much. A blind man wandered the ruins, reciting poetry none could understand. He claimed he once danced before the queen herself, barefoot on marble. When asked her name, he grew silent. Not because he had forgotten, but because to speak it was to feel again. He said names could open tombs his own chest, a sarcophagus of pain locked by memory's cruel hand. The children called him the walking scroll. Some painted images on their walls, stick figures, animals, gods with heads blurred. Not to remember, but to replace. They knew the old gods were gone, or sleeping, or angry. These new figures were offerings to no one, memories of a future that might never be. One boy drew a son with teeth. Another painted a mother holding two children, though she had none. The pictures flaked away by morning, but they drew them again. One girl spoke of dreams where the world was warm and filled with scent. In her sleep, she tasted melon and cinnamon, heard lyres, saw birds that shimmered like jewels. She woke with tears and refused food for 3 days, convinced her dreams were real and life a cruel mimicry. Her father buried her diary in an empty grave, saying, "Even paper carries the sickness of memory." The sick often whispered things from before the famine. As fever consumed them, they spoke of crowded markets, noisy festivals, fields heavy with barley. Their dying voices wove tapestries no one could touch. Some families gagged the dying so their memories would not spread, afraid that remembering too much might kill the living as well. One village built a tower of silence, not for the dead, but for stories. A single person was chosen to remember everything, to store every tale and name and face. The others forgot on purpose. They lived empty of past, free of memory's burden. The storyteller was kept separate, fed by hand, never allowed to sleep. Long, when he died, they burned the tower down. None asked what he remembered. Burial rituals changed. Tombs were no longer engraved with triumphs or lineages. Instead, they bore only one symbol, a spiral, turning inward. It meant, let it end here. Families stopped keeping heirlooms. One mother melted down her husband's seal to cast a nail for her son's sandal. The child never knew what walked beneath his heel. That was the point. A man once unearthed, a chest beneath a cracked floor. Inside were scrolls, a necklace, and a child's toy lion carved from ivory. He closed it quickly and buried it deeper. He knew if he touched those things, memory would awaken. And memory was heavier than hunger, sharper than loss. It made the wind colder, the sun dimmer, the breath thinner. Those who remembered too much often walked into the desert. Some returned, blistered and mute. Others never came back. There were whispers of a place beyond the dunes where memory burned out like a candle, where silence was clean and life began again. Whether it existed or not didn't matter. It gave people something to forget. Toward Dot, in one abandoned city, a young girl began carving words into walls. Not stories, but feelings. Shame, hope, alone. No one knew where she learned to write. Her messages became prayers, not to gods, but to the future. If you find this, know we were here. We tried. We remembered. When the city was swallowed by sand, her words were the last to disappear. The stars changed, or so they said. Constellations had shifted, or vanished, or been replaced. Astronomers wept in disbelief. Farmers refused to plant by them. The sky, one man muttered, remembers something different now. He never looked up again. His son stared every night, hoping to see the shape of his mother's face in the cosmos. Some made memory into ritual, not of triumph, but of pain. Once a year, they fasted not for the gods, but for the brothers and sisters they could no longer name. They sat in circles, stared at their feet, and tried to recall a single voice. Most couldn't. Some screamed. Others just wept. Then, they scattered, as if fleeing a ghost. Old songs returned, distorted and incomplete. A lullaby, half remembered, became a morning chant. A harvest hymn now marked burial. The lyrics, twisted to fit the times, golden grain beneath my hands, became ashes on my tongue. The children sang them anyway, unsure what they once meant. It didn't matter. They were all echoes now. A woman wrote memories into her skin with ink made of soot and goat's blood. Her arms read like a scroll, of love and loss, names of sons, seasons of rain, meals long gone. When she died, her body was not burned. It was wrapped and hidden deep in a tomb, sealed with salt, in hopes that one day, someone might read her again. The Nile, too, seemed to remember. Its waters, when they returned, flowed differently. The bends were unfamiliar, the banks more narrow. Fishermen claimed the river whispered at night, not in the voice of water, but in the voices of those it had swallowed. Do not remember me, it hissed. Just drink. Even laughter carried memory. It echoed in courtyards where once joy had reigned. Now, it sounded strange, hollow, cracked, like a drum with a broken skin. People laughed more often, though perhaps to fight the silence memory brought. But always after, there was a stillness, like something lost had been stirred. In the end, they learned that memory could not be buried forever. It cracked through silence like a weed through stone. It carved itself into faces, into the curve of a shoulder, the twitch of an eye. It lived, in dreams, in echoes, in the space between breaths. It was not just history, it was the weight of having survived. The storm outside had become eternal, yet it was not made of wind or rain, but of the silence of things collapsing, far away and slow. People began turning inward, not just into homes, but into themselves. Conversations shortened, eyes avoided each other, and greetings vanished from village lanes like smoke on a cold wind. What remained were long stares and hands working without purpose, chipping stone or grinding husks that would never grow again. The world outside had become too large to face, so they made themselves smaller, quieter. Once, the horizon had been a place of hope, a line drawn by sunrises and trade. Now it was an accusation. No caravans came, no priests from the north, no news from the east. Those who still dared to climb hills and look outward returned with the same story. Nothing. Not an army, not a god, not even birds. Just dust and more dust, blank as forgotten scrolls. So the hills went unclimbed. People learned not to ask. Shrines lost their incense. Temples lost their candles. The statues did not break, but they turned, two shadows, as if embarrassed by their own presence. People still passed by, sometimes pausing, but they didn't pray. They pressed their foreheads to stone, not to speak to the divine, but to feel coolness. They gave offerings not from faith, but from routine. It was easier than accepting that the gods had gone silent. Inside homes, families shrank. Brothers once, close now, sat across the room, arms folded, the silence between them as deep as the Nile in flood. Mothers sang to empty cradles. Fathers sharpened tools that would never be used. When they spoke, it was only 2 count days since the last rain, hours since the last visitor, times they'd dreamt the same dream. These numbers meant nothing, but counting gave them a rhythm. Dreams became more vivid than waking. They were not just escapes, they were maps, memories, warnings. People began drawing their dreams on walls with charcoal and crushed berries. Some painted doorways to nowhere, others drew creatures that crawled through mist. Many drew the sun, cracked in half or devoured by wings. When asked what they meant, they only replied, "It's coming," though none could say what it was. Children who once played in the dust now stared into it. They built no castles, no cities, but holes deep, narrow pits that they whispered into. Some claimed the holes whispered back. One child disappeared entirely. The hole he dug had filled with water overnight, dark and still. His mother never filled it in. She sat beside it each day, speaking softly into the mud. Some turned their homes into sanctuaries of memory. They covered the walls with symbols, strange combinations of old script and invented marks. They said the old words were dying, and new ones needed to be born. To survive, one woman whispered, "We must become unreadable to sorrow." She inked her ceiling with glyphs no one could decipher, not even herself. Meals became ceremonies. People ate in silence, staring at the food, as if unsure whether to thank it or apologize. Bread was broken carefully, like it held a soul. Bowls were washed slowly, then placed upside down in rows, as if to protect what little remained from being seen. Some whispered blessings, not to gods, but to the hands that had shaped the bowl, the seeds that had once felt the sun. Those who still walked spoke little. They wore their silence like robes. When they met others on the road, they simply nodded or placed a hand on the heart. A shared glance became more intimate than words. Some travelers walked with their eyes closed, saying they could feel the earth grieving. Others dragged long pieces of cloth behind them to erase their own footprints. Time fractured. Days stretched into endless twilight. People forgot how old they were. They marked time by events that never happened. Since the rains failed, since the dreams began, since the colors vanished, calendars lost their meaning. Birthdays became burdens. No one wanted to remember how much had been lost. A few built small fires in the desert and sat around them alone. They would not return until the flame died naturally. Some said this act cleansed the soul. Others said it was a way to speak to the earth. Those who returned rarely spoke of what they heard, but their eyes changed, more distant, more calm, as if they had made peace with vanishing. Inside the tomb cities, caretakers stopped preserving the dead. Instead, they listened to them. They swore the walls vibrated at night, not with spirits, but with sorrow so thick it hummed like bees. One man placed his ear to a sarcophagus and wept, saying, "They're telling me not to follow them." He sealed the tomb himself and never returned. Some crafted masks not to hide, but to preserve what was left inside. These masks bore no expression, blank, smooth, emotionless, made from mud, ash, and crushed shells. They cracked icily, and the people behind them rarely spoke. When a mask shattered, the wearer did not cry. They simply knelt, gathered the pieces, and buried them like a child. Music changed. It no longer aimed to soothe or celebrate. It became a single note, played over and over on broken flutes or hollow drums. The note did not rise, did not fall. It existed, stubbornly, like breath. Some claimed the note could keep grief away, or lure the gods back, or break the stone ceiling of the sky, but it never did. Still, they played it. Clothing darkened, Bright dyes were forgotten or rejected. People wore shades of soil, ash, and faded blood. Jewelry disappeared except for bone tokens carved with spirals or tears. Hair was left to grow, or shorn completely, depending on the mood. No one explained these changes. They simply happened, like seasons that came without warning. Some forgot their own names, not from madness, but from choice. "I no longer need to be who I was," one woman said, "because that world is gone." She chose a new name every moon. Others followed. In one village, no one had the same name for more than a week. "This is how we honor change," they said. "This is how we stay." Those who still carved stone began making inward spirals, tunnels with no entrance or exit. They said these led to the soul, not to the underworld. Some crawled inside them and did not return. One mason carved a perfect sphere from black basalt and placed it in the town square. He died 2 days later. The sphere was untouched by dust. For weeks, people said it had swallowed his memory. Rivers turned to mirrors, their surfaces stilled, and no wind disturbed them. Those who looked too long into their depths began to change. One woman lost the ability to speak. A boy aged overnight. A priest jumped in, saying he had seen the face of a god weeping. His body was never found. No one drank from those waters again. One city closed itself off entirely. They built no walls, but no one entered or left. Letters left at the edge of town vanished overnight. The city made no sound. Travelers passed it with heads down. They called it the hollow place. A trader once tried to enter and returned with no memory of who he was. Carrying a small statue of a closed eye, language itself began to fracture. Sentences shortened. Some words were spoken only once, then never again. People invented new phrases to explain the things they saw in dreams. One such phrase, "the dust remembers," became common. No one knew what it meant, but they said it when the air grew too still, or when shadows stretched the wrong way. The stars grew brighter, but more alien. Constellations shifted, taking shapes no one recognized. One man charted them every night, and saw patterns that resembled ancient warnings carved on stone: serpents eating suns, wings over burning cities, eyes weeping fire. He stopped charting when the stars formed a circle. "The sky is watching us forget," he said. In time, maps were destroyed. People no longer wanted to know where they were. They lived by scent, by the taste of the wind, by the patterns of moss. Direction became instinct. Movement became sacred. Some said that walking without a map was the only way to avoid being found by what waited beyond the dust. And still, they turned inward, because the world had turned away. And in that turning, they found something strange, perhaps not peace, but a stillness that did not fear silence. They did not forget the world. They did not abandon it. But they made rooms inside themselves where it could rest, where it could wait, patiently, to be remembered again. The first time someone noticed the sun changing, it wasn't dramatic. A shepherd, bone-thin and silent, stood atop a forgotten hill, watching the horizon as he did every morning. That day, the light came not as a blaze but as a trembling shimmer, like a pulse from beneath the earth. It lingered longer than before, not bright, just not gone. He did not smile or pray. He merely blinked, unsure if it was real, then turned and told no one, as if afraid the telling would undo it. Others saw it in smaller ways, the way dust motes glowed in shafts of light that hadn't existed in months. How the birds, long vanished, returned in fractured flocks that screamed as if remembering storms. They didn't nest, only circled overhead like they were unsure of the sky. But still, they came, and people watched them with hollow wonder, daring not to hope, only to witness. Crops remained dead, yet wild things bloomed without warning. Yellow flowers in the cracks of shattered roads, vines curling round tomb gates. A child picked one and tucked it behind her ear. Her mother slapped it away in fear, whispering that beauty was a trap sent by gods who hadn't yet forgiven. But that night, she searched the fields herself, and when she found a bloom, she wept into its petals and said nothing. In the temples, the candles that once refused to stay lit now burned longer. Priests who had forgotten how to chant began humming low, tuneless notes while sweeping floors. Then later, full hymns returned unbidden, from memory, as if sung from some space deep in the body that had waited in stillness. The gods did not answer, but the echoes didn't vanish. The river stirred, not a flood, not a rescue, but a twitch as if the Nile remembered its path after a long dream. Its trickle turned to murmur. Fish bones washed up, brittle but shaped. Like promises, a woman dipped her fingers in and pulled back, whispering that it was colder than she remembered. She said it felt like beginning again, like morning in reverse. The people did not celebrate. Joy had become too fragile, but they began to act differently, with small, quiet changes. Doors were left slightly ajar. Windows were unshuttered at night. Fire pits were dug not for warmth but for gatherings, not with music, not yet, but with stories, broken ones, often repeated, often wrong, but shared nonetheless. One man painted a sunrise on a wall that faced west. "So it never ends," he explained. His neighbors stared at it for hours, not commenting, just absorbing the color. When a child asked what the red meant, he replied, "It's the blood we don't shed anymore." No one laughed, but they nodded, because it felt true. A midwife, long barren of work, helped deliver her first child in nearly a year. The infant did not cry but breathed steadily, eyes open, silent as the moon. The mother asked what this meant. The midwife only replied, "It means we still belong here." She wrapped the child in cloth, dyed from the first flower she'd found, growing wild, and the dye held its color dot in the markets. A trader laid out 3 figs, shriveled but edible. No one bought them, but no one stole them either. By dusk, they were gone, and in their place was a small clay tablet, inscribed with the word "Return." No one claimed the message, but everyone saw it. The figs kept appearing, one by one, and the tablet remained untouched. The stars, once cold and judgmental, softened. Their light no longer pierced but bathed. Some constellations returned to their old shapes, others shifted into new ones. A girl said she saw a boat among the stars. Her grandfather told her that meant the souls were coming back. "They're rowing in silence," he said, "so we must listen closely." Old roads began to feel less haunted. Dust still rose, but it no longer stung the eyes. Footsteps echoed instead of being swallowed. Travelers returned, not many, but some each, carrying odd gifts. A carved mask, a new herb, a book of blank pages. When asked why they came back, they said, "Because we dreamed of home, and the dream had light." The sick began to sleep through. The night fevers broke without song or sacrifice. A healer mixed herbs that hadn't worked in years, and they worked again. "The bitterness is healing," she whispered, as if surprised. Word spread not as news, but as rumor, passed in the cadence of disbelief. No one trusted it fully, but they hoped in fragments. A statue in a forgotten shrine shed a tear knot, miraculous, only the result of condensation on aged stone. But those who saw it chose not to explain it. They knelt before it, not asking for favor, just to sit in the company of something that felt alive. They left offerings again, not from desperation, but respect. The stone remained still, but the silence changed. Winds shifted. For moons they had carried only ash and cold. Now they brought the scent of unfamiliar places, damp soil, salt air, crushed herbs. "The world is breathing again," a boy said. "It doesn't know our names yet, but it remembers us." People began to listen to the breeze like it carried instructions. They followed it without knowing where it led. In one village, laughter returned, not loud, not frequent, but unmistakable. A dog barked, chasing a beetle through a courtyard. Children clapped. An elder chuckled and covered his mouth, ashamed, but no one shamed him. "We forgot that sound," he said, almost afraid. "We forgot we could make it." The dog barked again, and this time everyone joined in. The dead remained buried, but dreams of them grew gentler. They no longer wept or warned. They walked, beside the living in silence, watching with soft eyes. Some said their loved ones were teaching them how to come back without hurting the world. "They don't want us to vanish like they did," a widow said. "They want us to remain but remember." Rituals lost their rigidity. They became movements of instinct. One woman danced with dust on her feet, drawing spirals in her courtyard each morning. She called it telling the earth, "We're still here." Others joined, not in unison, but in harmony. Each found their own rhythm. The dust rose, not as a curtain, but as a veil thin enough to see through. Time, which had once fractured, began to mend. Calendars were redrawn, not to control days, but to honor them. Each day was given a name: the day of quiet hands, the day the bird returned, the day the bread rose. They were not numbered, they were remembered. "We count not to measure," said one man, "but to witness." Art reappeared on walls, not grand murals, but simple lines, handprints, eyes, suns with too many rays. A child painted a fish beside a grain stalk and said it was a dream of tomorrow. Her parents didn't correct her. They hung it by the door and kissed it each morning before they left. "Let this be a prayer," the father whispered. Eyes met again. People didn't flinch when spoken to. They answered questions. They held hands. They sat in silence without fear. They opened doors and stepped outside, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The world was not healed, but it was listening. And in that listening, people spoke differently, less as survivors, more as co-creators. A woman stood at the edge of a lake that had once swallowed a village. She held a lantern in her hand and whispered into the still water, "We remember you. We are not afraid anymore." The lantern flickered. The wind did not answer, but in her face there was peace, and in her silence there was space for what came next. And slowly the sun did return. Not all at once, not in glory, but in moments. A little earlier each morning, a little warmer each dusk, a bit more color, a bit less fear. People did not cheer, they did not worship, they simply watched, together, and for the first time in years, they felt that time might belong to them again. Long after the ash had settled, and the sun resumed its quiet arc, long after temples were reclaimed by roots and sand, echoes of the great dimming refused to vanish. They clung to stone walls, etched in hieroglyphs too warped to translate, yet still pulsing with memory. Travelers centuries later would find these marks and feel something stir beneath their skin, a wordless tremor, like the voice of a world once wounded trying to speak through layers of silence and time. Scholars in distant cities, clutching fragile papyri, debated whether such a catastrophe had truly occurred or if it was merely myth wrapped in metaphor. But whenever they attempted to dismiss it, strange coincidences arose, plagues in far-off lands that mimicked the descriptions. Temples buried deeper than logic allowed, stars recorded in unfamiliar alignments. History, it seemed, had shadows, longer than the sun could ever cast, dot in highlands where few dared venture. Old women told tales to children beside dwindling hearths. They spoke of days when the sky bled darkness and the rivers forgot their paths. Their voices cracked, not with age but with reverence, as if each word kept something monstrous at bay. The children didn't understand, but in listening, they carried the tale forward into generations that had never seen famine but somehow feared it still. Some monks etched the memory into the margins of sacred texts, not as sermons, but as warnings. Between prayers and genealogy, they drew crude suns with slashes through them, tiny figures kneeling beneath a clouded sky. They never spoke of these images aloud, yet they reappeared again and again on chapel doors, in carvings beneath altars, stitched secretly into the hems of robes. Their meaning remained obscure, but their repetition ensured they would not be forgotten. Bards in mountain kingdoms sang of the centuries of shadow, their songs filled with metaphor so layered that even they forgot the truth behind them. Still, their audiences wept when they heard those notes. The chords struck something ancient and real, some mourning passed down through the blood. Even kings sat silent during these verses, cups untouched, eyes closed, remembering things they had never lived. One dynasty in a rising empire refused to wear yellow or gold. It was decreed that the sun's color was sacred and must not be mixed. When asked why, the ruling priestess only said, "Because it left once, and we are not yet worthy." No one questioned her. And so, for 200 years, the empire glittered in silver, gray, and white luminous, but always lacking warmth. Philosophers in marble-walled academies postulated that collective trauma could inscribe itself into the human spirit the same way water shapes stone. Perhaps, one said, our fear of silence, our worship of fire, our dread of the eclipse, all these come not from superstition, but from memory too old to name. He was laughed at, but his scrolls were copied in secret. In a desert monastery, a recluse monk spent his life building a sundial that functioned at night. It never quite worked, yet he insisted the stars could be trusted more than the sun. "They never abandon us," he whispered. "They remain when the sky breaks." His creation became a pilgrimage site, not for timekeeping, but for reflection. People knelt beside it and left pieces of glass or burnt wood, remnants of ancient disasters, never recorded but always known. In rainy northern valleys, people constructed labyrinths out of black stones. When asked their purpose, they claimed walking them cured sorrow that had no cause. "It draws grief out through the feet," they said. The paths twisted under open skies, and some who walked them claimed to hear whispers, faint voices, reciting the names of rivers long dead, or gods no longer worshipped. In remote shrines carved into cliffs, hidden faces stared down with eyes of obsidian. No one remembered who carved them or when, but offerings were still left: dried herbs, feathers, bits of bread. Some swore the statues wept on cloudless days. Others claimed the stone faces warmed in moonlight. Pilgrims came with questions and left in silence, carrying more than they could explain. One painter, during the peak of a forgotten Renaissance, created a mural titled "The World That Stopped Turning." It showed no figures, only landscapes of dark skies, twisted trees, and rivers turning backward. It was banned in most cities, declared heretical, but copies spread through the underworld of art, inspiring a generation of works, all circling a single, inexplicable melancholy. Languages that evolved centuries later still bore strange phrases. To wake with the dim sun meant to mourn. To eat ash bread meant to suffer loss. To sleep beneath the veiled sky meant to wait for something that might never return. No one remembered their origin, yet they persisted. Words, it seemed, remembered long after mouths forgot. One civilization, before collapsing into ruin, constructed a hall of mirrors angled so the sun could be seen at every hour. At the center stood a black stone where no reflection ever appeared. Tourists, centuries later, dubbed it the Absence. No one knew its purpose, but standing there made people shiver, as if the sun itself had blinked out for just a moment. Sailors told of a sea that remained warm even during the coldest storms. Its depths were said to glow faintly at night, not with fish, but with echoes of fire from long ago. The locals called it the Drowned Flame. Those who fished its waters sang to it softly, not songs of harvest, but lullabies, as if coaxing something still sleeping below. In tombs unearthed by accident, archaeologists found skeletons wrapped in cloaks, stitched with suns, moons, and veiled faces. One such tomb contained a scroll too faded to read. Yet when placed under moonlight, faint lines reappeared, diagrams of the sky, notes on the Nile's behavior, and prayers to the returning light. None could determine its date, but all agreed it had been buried with reverence, not fear. A festival in one alpine town celebrated the breaking of the gloom. No one knew why it started, but each year, villagers doused every fire before dawn and waited in silence. At the first sign of sunlight, they relit their hearths and sang an ancient chant whose language no one spoke. Children asked what the words meant, and elders only smiled. "It's the sound that brought the sun back," they said. Books written in secret monasteries referenced the age of forgetting, warning that even recovery could be dangerous if it erased the memory of what nearly ended all things. "Forget the darkness," one scribe wrote, "and you will call it back without meaning to." The phrase was echoed in countless manuscripts, hidden in footnotes and margins like a sacred caution. In dreams recounted across continents, people described the same image: a vast dead tree with the sun caught in its branches. Sometimes the sun was golden, sometimes black, but always the dreamer felt watched by something older than time. They awoke in tears or awe. It wasn't a nightmare, many insisted. It was a remembering. In a distant coastal city, a cathedral's highest spire bore no cross, or staringly a disk with jagged edges, half covered by a sculpted cloud. When asked, the builders said, "It is what we survived." The city's coat of arms bore a broken sun and a vine growing through it. Their motto was, "Even the light can be reborn." Children, drawing in dust and chalk, sometimes doodled suns with eyes, or skies raining black drops. When asked what they were drawing, they shrugged. "It's just a feeling," they'd say. Their parents would glance at each other uneasily, knowing that some stories pass not through words but through bone, breath, and the blood that remembers. And so the echoes continued, not loud, not constant, but ever present. They threaded through centuries, hiding in lullabies, etched in ruins, whispered by wind through forgotten temples. The world moved on, rebuilt, reimagined, reborn, but deep beneath the turning soil and circling stars, the memory remained, patient and unyielding, a song still unfinished, humming beneath history's breath. The dust beneath our feet carries a silence older than memory, the kind that presses against the bones when we walk alone at twilight. It isn't simply earth or a shit, it's remnants of breath once exhaled by pharaohs, sweat fallen from starving, Priests, tears spilled by mothers watching skies that would not clear. Every grain has a past, and though we tread over it without thought, it remembers, quietly, endlessly. Once, entire empires stood atop this dust. Palaces stretched high, their bricks baked in desert sun, gilded by laborers who no longer exist, except in crushed fragments beneath our sandals. The dust remembers the rhythm of their songs, the scratch of their chisels, the tired hum of their hunger. It holds no judgment-only record. Each breeze that lifts the dust does not simply stir, it awakens it. Across courtyards where gods were once praised, now only sparrows nest, yet the dust swirls in shapes of old processions, imagined banners, fluttering, half-remembered chants echoing faintly between broken pillars. The past dances briefly in the wind before settling again into stillness. When children play in the shadow of ancient stones, their laughter carries unaware above a silence, heavy with collapse. They do not know that beneath them are burial pits of forgotten names, that the dust clinging to their toes once choked cities that cried for rain. But the dust knows. It hums gently against their souls, like a warning offered too late. Some nights, when moonlight catches the desert just right, outlines of vanished roads reappear, faint scars in the earth, where caravans once groaned and merchants counted coins under flickering lamps. Follow the dust long enough, and you find stories without storytellers, crossroads without names, ruins whose builders are ghosts in their own myths. Archaeologists sift through the dust with careful hands, believing they uncover truth. But the dust lies, not maliciously, but with indifference. It swallows ivory, bone, and bronze alike. It rearranges centuries, confuses cultures, blurs battle from ritual. It tells stories with holes in them, and the silence it leaves is louder than discovery. There were years when the dust was all that remained. Famine had taken the grain, the scribes had fled, the statues had cracked under the weight of despair. Yet the dust stayed thick, unyielding, coating every sacred surface. In temples where prayers once echoed, now only coughing could be heard. The dust settled in lungs, made relics of the living dot. It was said that even the gods coughed then, that their breath stuttered as the dust rose higher in the sanctuaries. Offerings turned to powder before reaching the altars. Priests whispered spells that stuck dry in their mouths. The sun, veiled in ash and fear, watched silently as kingdoms became tombs buried before their last rites were spoken. And still, the dust absorbed it all, the bones of betrayed generals, the broken bracelets of queenly arms, the crushed reeds of scrolls never read. It layered itself over memory like sleep over the mind, erasing color and clarity. Cities faded not with war, but with the soft, relentless hand of settling particles. In the corners of tombs, one finds fingerprints preserved in ancient dust swirls, perhaps from a fleeing servant or the final stroke of a forgotten artisan. They are moments, suspended, intimate, and fragile, locked beneath centuries of sediment. The dust does not mourn, but it does not forget either. Sometimes, those who live near the ruins claim the dust speaks, not with voices, but with feelings. A chill before a sandstorm, a heaviness before sleep, a taste like copper in dry mouths. The old ones, they mutter, spitting to clear their tongues. The ones the sun turned from, they sweep their floors with salt to ward off memory. In distant capitals, far from the desert, museums display fragments polished and labeled. Behind glass, bits of bone and gold gleam sterile, yet the dust that once clung to them is absent, filtered away, discarded. Without it, the pieces lose context. They seem hollow tokens without weight. Only in the dust do they breathe. Nomads, who crossed ancient lands, walk with reverence, not out of superstition, but recognition. Their camels tread softly over places where cities once stood. They do not mark the map, for they know the map lies. The real terrain is the dust, soft where fire once burned, sharp where tears once fell. They read it like scripture. When storms rise, they bring back the past. The wind howls like distant mourning, and grains sting like reminders. Once, in a violent sandstorm, a long-buried statue was revealed, its face half-raised, its eyes still proud. The locals buried it again the next day. Let it rest, they said. The dust covered it for a reason. Burial customs evolved, shaped by the dust's temperament. Corpses were wrapped tighter, tombs sealed deeper, as if to resist the slow intrusion of the earth's forgetting. But still, the dust finds a way. It creeps through cracks, makes mummies into mulch, chews inscriptions into gibberish. It turns every burial into exile. And yet, not all in the dust is decay. Within its grains are the seeds of things that might return if, not as they were, then as echoes. Pottery fragments become songs in a new tongue. Shattered beads inspire new rituals. The dust reuses everything. It is not destruction, but transformation drawn out over lifetimes. Pilgrims gather handfuls of dust from sacred sites and mix it into clay or oil. They smear it on doors, wear it in amulets. They believe it brings dreams of other times. Sometimes it does. A merchant dreams of grain riots. A midwife hears foreign prayers. A soldier sees a river run dry. They wake uneasy, knowing something vast passed through them. Even now, beneath pavement and cities built atop the bones of those who once worshipped stars differently, the dust shifts. It breathes when subway trains pass overhead. It listens when libraries burn. It grins when we call ourselves eternal. The dust knows better. It has seen eternity rust. In ancient ballads, there's always mention of the sigh beneath the sandals, a phrase lost on modern ears. But it means the dust, the quiet pushback of the past, ever underfoot. Heroes ignore it. Sages bend to hear it. The wise carry it in pouches on their belts, not for magic, but for perspective. Rulers tried once to command the dust. They built towers with dust-repelling walls, marched armies in sandals soaked in oil. But the dust waited. When the towers fell, when the sandals dried, it returned not with vengeance, but inevitability. The dust does not rage. It simply resumes. We write our names in concrete, thinking them immortal. We build pyramids again, just taller and with glass. But even these gleamings dull. Even these names fade. The dust watches from the corners of our skylines, patient, licking at the edges of memory. One day it will reclaim us, as it did them. And when it does, perhaps 1,000 years from now, someone will walk across the dunes, and the dust beneath their feet will hum with our names not spoken, but known. It will carry the shape of our shadows, the taste of our fears, the warmth of our vanished breath. They will not see us, but they will feel us, and know, the dust remembers.